Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on Incoterms, Rules and Update on Incoterms 2020. My name is Vanita D'Souza. I'm a Communications Manager at Drip Capital and your host for today. We have with us Mr. Mihir Shah, an ICC Incoterms 2020 registered trainer in India. Thank you, Mr. Shah, for joining us today to share your insight with our audience. Before we decide to go ahead, let me take a moment to introduce Drip Capital to you. Like many of us know, access to finance is one of the major pain points amongst MSMEs, and the COVID-19 pandemic has only made things worse for small businesses. Drip Capital is a global trade finance company. The company offers post-shipment collateral financing to MSME exporters in India. Drip works with over 1,500 sellers and 700 buyers across 80 plus countries. Drip has financed over 1.2 billion worth of international trade since its inception in 2016. To know more about Drip Capital or to receive a call from us, kindly fill the form which is shared in the chat section. A note to the audience, during the webinar, you may submit your questions in the Q&A section on Zoom. For people who are watching us on YouTube, you can post the question in the live chat section. All the questions will be addressed at the end of this webinar. To the uniqueness of each region and the country influences the local dialect. This is true even among English-speaking countries. We all know how a lorry in the UK is called a truck in the US. However, the International Chamber of Commerce has made sure that no such ambiguity exists when it comes to businesses. With this in mind, it came up with the Incoterms, which stands for the International Commercial Terms. It not only helps buyers and sellers clarify their doubts regarding foreign trade contracts, but also helps them carry business arrangements smoothly. Some of these Incoterms apply to any mode of transportation. Some of them apply only to transportation across sea and inland waterways. To help us decode Incoterms, we have with us today Mr. Mihir Ajit Shah. He's an MBA and an LLB. Mr. Shah offers consultancy and advisory services in relation to foreign trade policy, GST, FEMA, RBI, customs, excise, and other allied subjects related to export-import business. He also provides training in the field of international business, covering various topics from basic setup to marketing, government incentives, international trade agreements, and GST for foreign trade. And as you know, he's also an ICC Incoterms registered trainer in India. I now ask Mr. Shah to address our viewers.
Very good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Vanita, for that lovely introduction. And once again, thanks to Drip Capital and team, Rashmi, and everybody to invite me again for this session. In fact, Vanita has already done my work easy by setting up the context to Incoterms 2020 and Incoterm rules. So let me quickly share the presentation and then take this thing further for all the sessions. Okay, can I just quickly, sorry, I think I have. Okay, let me quickly share the screen. Yes. Okay, I'm sure you were able to see the screen as well as the presentation.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so all the participants, attendees who are on Zoom can obviously use the chat box to reply or to interact with me. The questions obviously will be taking up at the end in the Q&A, but at least for the interactive thing or interactions which I prefer to have with you guys, I'll prefer if you can use the chat box. That will give me a real update on the live platform. So friends, we are talking about Incoterm rules, and this is something which in a very regular business of export and import mainly, even in domestic, has been actually used knowingly or unknowingly. And in most of the cases, when the seller and the buyer agree on certain terms and the transactions happen smoothly, then it hardly matters what the Incoterms were and what was the obligation or what was the understanding between the seller and the buyer. It is only the rare possibility or the limited time where there are disputes or there are issues, where there are challenges, where then decides or issues come up where who was supposed to do what. who was supposed to bear what cost, how things were supposed to be delivered. So in fact, in a regular term, you could effectively say Incoterm is nothing but terms of delivery. If you are regular into export business, if you're regular into international business, you create your invoice and there's a column which you by default fill up is called terms of delivery and terms of payment. In that terms of delivery is nothing but Incoterms. Before I further move ahead, it is my obvious duty to confirm and inform you all that Incoterms 2020 and the logos are trademark of the ICC. For exact and detailed information, you should visit the ICC official website, iccwbo.org. Now, to give you a background of what Incoterm rules are, what Incoterms is set up, we need to go back a little and understand that there's an organization called International Chamber of Commerce, who effectively was started after the World War I to support the international business, international trade. It was effectively started by 5 people. They were called Merchants of Peace. And that 5 people grew to now having presence or membership across 120 countries, having 13 ICC offices globally, including one based out of New Delhi in India. ICC has been pivotal in creating a few of some remarkable rules and regulations, like Incoterms, as we are going to be discussing, the UCP 600, under which the letter of credits are created, and many others to tell you. Global business, international business has been supported regularly with ICC and the publications which ICC create. In fact, ICC also is now part of the United Nations, so it becomes as the apex trade body for the global business. When we're talking about Incoterms, we're talking about terms of delivery. We are talking about the understanding between the seller and the buyer with respect to goods, with respect to what are they supposed to be delivered at, how are they going to be delivered at, what are the costs involved, and who is going to bear the costs. Incoterms were created way back in 1936, and they have been regularly updated on a very regular method or regular timeline. In very recent past, Incoterms have been updated regularly on a 10-year gap. So we had Incoterms 2000, then we had Incoterms 2010, and then now we have Incoterms 2020. The good part or the important part of 2020 is that though it is Incoterms 2020 effective from 1st of January 2020, it was launched much earlier on 10th of September 2019 so that the trade, the business, everybody could get used to, understand, and get the gist of how the 2020 Incoterms are going to be there. Let us understand the basis and the principles of Incoterm rules first. To begin with, Incoterm rules are explained in a set of 3-letter trade terms, reflecting business-to-business practice in a contract of sale of goods. The Incoterm rules describes mainly task, costs, and risks involved in the delivery of the goods from seller to the buyer. This is what the official text is. I've just given you a verbatim of it. Key elements which you have to be focusing on. Obviously, it is an identification by a 3-letter word, but the key is it is part of a B2B. So if you are doing a B2C transaction, then technically Incoterm rules doesn't play into it. Second, it is applicable in a sale of goods transaction and not in sale of service. So whenever you're offering goods, it is going to be Incoterm rules will be applicable, but not in case of sale of service. And do remember that Incoterm is not the answer of everything into your transaction or trade or business. Incoterm rules are part of the contract of the sale. Contract is the key. Contract is the base document. Contract is the most important detail. In that contract, you're going to use Incoterm rules as a part of terms of delivery. And Incoterm rules is going to focus on three main aspects. Those are tasks or obligations, cost, who will bear what cost, the expenses, and risk. Very, very important, that risk meaning the risk of any loss or damage to the goods, because the goods are going to go from seller to the buyer. At what point, at what that moment does the risk change hands from the seller to the buyer? It's not necessary only that when you get physical possession of the goods, only then the risk gets transferred. No. So we have to understand that in which rule, under which Incoterm, where does the risk get transferred from the seller to the buyer. So Incoterm rules preliminary define three things between a seller and a buyer of B2B goods. That is obligation and tasks, risks and costs. The latest version of Incoterms is Incoterms 2020. We've already said this is announced, or it was launched on 10th of September 2019. And to help you understand each of these rules, each rules have set of 10 sub-rules, A1 to A10 from the seller and responding B1 to B10 for the buyer. So each of these sub-rules in each of the Incoterm rules help you understand that the conditions applicable in terms of who has what tasks and obligations, who has what risks, and where does the risk get transferred, and who has what cost to pay. As far as Incoterms 2020 is concerned, we totally have 11 Incoterm rules. We totally have 11 Incoterm rules. For people who are already well versed with Incoterms 2010, Incoterms 2020 almost replicate the same. Out of the 11, the 10 rules, there's only one rule which was modified from DAT. So Incoterms 2010 had a rule called DAT, delivered at terminal. That replaced to a new term called DPU, delivered at place unloaded. As you can see on the slide, the first 7 Incoterms, which are in these orange color, brown orange color, they are used, or they can be used for any mode of transport or even multimodal transport. But the 4 at the bottom, which are in blue color, can only be used for waterways or sea and inland water transport. So 7 can be used for all modes of transport, and the 4 can only be used for sea or waterways. We totally have 11 Incoterms. Many times people do ask, which is the one is the very good one, or which is the best. Please understand, you have an option of 11 Incoterms, each having each rules and regulations, each having something good for seller, something good for buyer, each being a little more inclined to one of the side. But it is nothing called as best or nothing called as worst. It is your choice. It is a choice between the seller and the buyer who agree to do certain things. It is more important to understand the purpose of Incoterm is that whatever you select, you both, the seller and the buyer, know exactly the same thing in the same sense. So in all, we have 11 Incoterms. I hope I'm clear till this. People or those who are connected on, at least on the Zoom, I see about 110 attendees here. My quick question to you is, if you have been understanding what I've just explained, I have a quick question for you. I have a shipment going by sea. As an exporter, how many options of Incoterms do I have to choose from? You can put your answers on the chat. I'm exporting by sea. How many options of Incoterms do I have? All right. So all those who said 4, friends, you have just jumped the gun. The answer is 11, because the 7 which can be used for all modes of transport includes even waterways. All right. So trust me, it would have not been a simple question to be asked if it was only 4, because 4 is right up on your screen. So 4 can only be used for waterways, but the 7 can use for all modes. Effectively for water transport, all 11 Incoterms are usable. Fantastic. So many of you have got it right. Many of you have not, but fair enough. It also tells me that many of you are quite active in attending it. Thank you so much. Now, as I said, each of them have their own rules and regulations. Each of them are having certain obligations and tasks depending upon whether it's more towards the seller or to the buyer. As I could understand this, and I could feel that because the goods are always sold from the seller to the buyer, I've rearranged them into a segment which says we start with the seller, giving the least obligation, least cost, least risk to the seller, and then adding it way up to the buyer. So this is my arrangement. Did not be necessary that this is how you want to consider arranging, or this is not necessary that this is how the Incoterms have to be remembered, but this is my arrangement so that I can understand and make you understand a little more easier. So X works, it is in overall giving the least obligation, least tasks, least cost. These are the 3 elements. So least cost, least task, and least obligations to the seller. As you can see, it is very far from the buyer. So buyer has to do the maximum of risk, cost, obligation. Whereas DDP, delivered duty paid, is very close to the buyer. Hence, it gives the least obligation, least cost, and least risk to the buyer. But the seller has to bear a lot of risk, cost, and tasks and obligations, which he has to do more. So X works is one end, DDP is another end. We all know that marriages happen in center. So effectively, between a seller and a buyer, it will be any of those midterms which generally would be acceptable. Not that X works is not acceptable. Not that. Oh, is my audio not clear? Vinita, can I have a check or confirm? Is my audio very clear or not clear?
Sir, it's quite clear.
Okay, fine. Pravinji, I think you'll have to check at your end with the network. Thank you, guys. Thank you so much. Appreciate. So DDP is one end, XWorks is another, depend upon your buyer and seller's requirement. But this is how we're going to look at this process. So we're going to start looking at the first Incoterm, which is XWorks. Please understand the rule of the game. The Incoterm is a 3-letter trade term. So for XWorks, the 3 letters are EXW. Then you have a bracket which defines certain things. For each Incoterm, it has a specific mention. So in this case, it says named place of delivery. And then obviously the rule which you are following, which is Incoterms 2020. And the named place of delivery in XWorks is ideally the seller's premises. So it will be at the seller's godown, seller's warehouse, seller's factory, seller's place, which is more comfortable because that's the XWorks, right? So typically that's the name place of delivery. It can be any place which the seller prefers, but trust me, it has to be the closest to the seller. Maybe if seller has 2 factories, it will be one of the factory. If he has 3 godowns, it will be one of the godown. If he has 3 warehouses, maybe one of the warehouses. Whichever is closest to the seller so that he has the least obligation, least cost. Why it is important, we will discuss it in a bit. So each of these Incoterms has 10 subrules. So let's see what are these subrules and why are they important and how they help us understand this. So X works. Let's take an example. That a foreign buyer based out of USA has, let's say I see a lot of people's name on my list and the attendees. Let me pick up. Okay, Mr. Daksh Gupta is one of the exporter and one of our participant. So let's say Mr. Gupta is one of the seller. He has got a buyer based out of USA and they have agreed for X works as the Incoterm. So Mr. Daksh Gupta, who is the seller, Indian seller, and I am the foreign buyer, let's say. I am the buyer based out of USA. So we have to understand what does the meaning X works mean, because what Mr. Gupta understand and what I understand should be at the same sense. Otherwise, the chances of dispute are higher. So the first obligation, first rule, A1B1, is general obligations. A1B1 is general obligations. What is a general obligation? First, A1, the seller, that is Mr. Gupta, must provide the goods and the commercial invoice. Two things he has to provide. He has to provide the goods and he has to provide the invoice in conformity with the contract of sale. Now, please understand, this is important. Incoterm doesn't deal with the product, quality, size, anything. It is the contract of sale which deals it. Incoterm says, Mr. Gupta, the seller has to provide the goods. He has to provide me an invoice. Only these two things. This is his mandatory obligation. But that does not mean if I have ordered Mr. Gupta red color ball pens, he gives me black color ball pens, because the goods should be in conformity with the contract of sale. If with the contract of sales, the invoice should be $10,000. He cannot charge me $12,000 because the commercial invoice should be in conformity with the contract of sale. So the contract of sale is the base document on which the Incoterm plays. So it is his obligation to give me goods and invoice. These are the two basic and the most important thing. Apart from that, any other evidence that could be in form of a documentation or any other proof of conformity in terms of the goods as may be required in the contract, which means goods are the first and the most primarily important thing. The second is the invoice or the commercial invoice. Apart from this, any documents, any details which is part of the contract is what he's supposed to give. If for any reason the contract is silent, still Mr. Daksh Gupta has to provide me goods and invoice. That's his obligation. And if the contract says I'll require XYZ test certificate or any other report, any photograph, anything else as per the contract, then those documents will also be part of the general obligation under A1. If the documents are asked specifically in the agreement in the physical form, or it is a customary to give in physical form, then it will be in physical form. Otherwise, it can be either in physical or digital, depending upon what is the common practice, what is possible. So that's the A1. That's the general obligation of the seller. What is the general obligation of the buyer? What is the buyer supposed to do? The general obligation of the buyer is he must pay the price of the goods. This is my obligation. Now, please understand, when I say I have to pay price of the goods, it doesn't mean that I have to pay him today. I have to pay him now. I have to pay him at the time of delivery. No. It says I must pay, which also directly or indirectly says I must agree to pay, or I must pay, or I must show the willingness to pay by way which is as provided in the contract of sale. So if the contract of sales gives me a credit of 90 days, which means I have to sign a bills of exchange, I will do so. If the contract is under LC, then it is the LC which I have issued, which will confirm my obligation that I'm ready to pay. So it is not necessary that I have to pay means cash payment now, but I have to do an action which is in line with the obligation that I'm supposed to pay the price of the goods. The goods are not coming free, of course, they are coming with a price. So the buyer has to agree to pay for it. Accept the documents either in electronic form or in manual form, or which I have insisted specifically in the agreement in a manual form. So either digital or manual, depending upon what is relevant practice, what is the customary, or what I've insisted specifically for. So general obligation A1, B1. The good news is this general obligation of A1, B1 is constant. It is constant. It is same for all 11 Incoterms. So whether it is XWorks, whether it is FOB, whether it is CIF, whether it is DAP or DDP, any of the 11 Incoterms, it is the same A1, B1. All right. So general obligations is done. What is the next? Next is delivery. Next is delivery. Remember, there were three aspects of Incoterms: obligations or task, risks, and cost. And one of the key element is risk. And for that risk, which is the next rule, before that, delivery is key and most important. A general concept for anybody, including you and me, when we go out to buy products, delivery means physical possession, not necessary in this case. So you have to understand that what amounts to be a delivery in case of each of the 11 Incoterms. And trust me, in each of the 11 Incoterms, the delivery spot, I would say that moment, the time, the exact thing is different. If this is the delivery in XWorks, there could be something else meaning delivery in other Incoterms. So it is very, very important that you understand where the delivery is happening. As far as XWorks is concerned, we are looking at the Incoterm rule XWorks. As far as XWorks is concerned, the delivery, the seller must deliver the goods by placing them at the disposal of the buyer at the agreed point, if any, at the named place of delivery, and I'll repeat this last line, not loaded on any collecting vehicle. Not loaded on any collecting vehicle. This is one of the most common myth that when people say XWorks. So first and foremost, XWorks, when you have said, where is the good going to be delivered? Now please go back to the structure of the Incoterm. XWorks name place of delivery. So name place of delivery is this to do with A2. In A2, which is by placing it at the name place of delivery. So the name place of delivery is, let's say, the factory of Mr. Gupta. It is the factory of, or it's a warehouse which he has decided. Whatever be the premise which is put, that name address will come in that bracket, which is name place of delivery. At that place, in his factory, in his warehouse, the moment he places the goods ready at the disposal of the buyer, meaning if the buyer comes in, he can take the goods. He's got an access to take the goods. Then the goods are deemed to be delivered. It is delivered. Do note that the seller is not required to load the cargo on the vehicle which the buyer sends. I am the foreign buyer. When I contract on XWorks, obviously I need to send the truck to collect the goods. When my truck goes to, let's say, a factory of Mr. Dinesh Sharma, being the seller, Mr. Sharma and I have a contract XWorks at his warehouse. When I send the truck, it is not his obligation to load it onto the collecting vehicle. It is my obligation to collect, meaning to pick it up from his warehouse, load it into the truck and do it. It is the buyer's obligation. Seller is not required to load the cargo on the collecting vehicle. This is one of the most common myth, because we assume XWorks means putting it on the truck which the buyer sends. No. XWorks doesn't include loading onto the truck or the collecting vehicle. What is the buyer supposed to do? The buyer is supposed to deliver goods when it is delivered and inform about delivery and give him the notice under A10. I'll explain A10 as we go further, but the delivery in A2, which is at the named place, at that factory, at that warehouse, at that godown, when it is ready, from that point, I must take the delivery. That's my obligation. I cannot say, oh, no, I will not take delivery from this place. No. It's my obligation. It's my task that I have to do, that I have to do it. It's a lot of echo is happening on audio. Is that how it is?
No, sir.
Okay, guys, you'll have to check the audio at your end. I believe the connection is okay at my end. Okay, so a couple of people are getting audio, so I said, let me just check. Thank you. Guys, if you get an echo, I think just, switch on, switch off, or if you're having multiple devices connected at the same place, you might have an audio echo. Fine. Thank you, sir. Thank you, everyone, for confirming that the audio is fine. So do remember that the delivery is complete the minute I have put it at the named place, which is my factory, which is my godown. My meaning the seller's godown, the seller's factory. In our case, Mr. Dinesh Sharma's factory. The minute he's kept it on that day which we have agreed, ready for the buyer to collect it, the goods are delivered. And why this is important? This is important because of A3B3, which is talking about risk, transfer of risk. And what does A3B3 say? A3 says the seller bears all risk of loss or damage of goods until they have been delivered. Under A2. A2 is the place where the delivery happened. And this A3B3 is fixed for all 11 Incoterms. The only thing which changes is the delivery spot. So A2 becomes important. But what is A3B3? A3B3 says the transfer of risk. If any loss of goods or damage of the goods happening until they are delivered in A2, then it is the obligation of the seller. Any loss happening, the buyer bears all risks, costs, or damage to the goods from the time, the moment it is delivered under A2. So the moment I have delivered the goods at the named place, that is, the seller has delivered it at the named place in his factory, from that moment, the risk is transferred from the seller to the buyer, because as far as A2 for X works is concerned, it is the named place you are required to keep the goods ready for the disposal. You do not have to load it into the truck. You don't have to do anything as a seller. That is not your obligation. That is buyer's problem. That is the buyer who has to take the delivery. So obviously taking the delivery, meaning he has to take sure that from the ground, from that warehouse, from the workshop, from the factory, he will load it into the truck and then bring it to his factory or to the country. It is seller who bears the risk until the goods are delivered. Now, please note, until the goods are delivered in X works, it is the closest to the seller, and buyer bears all the risk from the time it is delivered as far as A2 is concerned. Obviously, if for any reason buyer fails to give notice of delivery, which is A2, A10, B10, that is the date and decide the time, and because of non-delivery or because of non-giving the notice of delivery, the seller incurs some cost, then that also is on the buyer, because the buyer is in the position to decide when to take the delivery, when to accept the delivery. They decide the time and the date and the period. But if it's not done that within, let's say if there's an agreed period, then it is not on the seller, but it is on the buyer, because the seller is ready to deliver, but the buyer has not identified the date or the period or the time when he's going to take the delivery. So if there's an inaction on the buyer's front, there also buyer gets penalized by the risk of any loss, damage to the goods will be to the buyer. So until it is delivered, it is seller. After it is delivered, it is buyer. Now, please remember, A3B3 remains the same for all 11 Incoterms. What changes is A2, which is the delivery spot. And this is the critical aspect why it is important. If you've understood till this, I have a quick question for all of you. And again, you can reply to me on the chat. Is a buyer and a seller contracted on the Ex Works terms? So today is the delivery date. The buyer sends the truck. The seller has kept 100 cartons ready at the disposal of the factory so the buyer can take it. The goods were being loaded onto the truck. 95 cartons were loaded and the 96th carton was being loaded on the truck. While the 96th carton was being loaded, 4 cartons fell off. And because it fell off and it fell off on the cartons which were down, it damaged that 4 and the 4 which fell off, 8. Whose risk it is, seller or the buyer? Okay. For all those who said seller, friends, delivery is completed the moment the goods were there in the Ex Works at the place. Anything after delivery, the buyer bears all risk of loss or damage of the goods from the time it is delivered. Loading onto the truck was buyer's responsible. So when buyer was loading, at that point, anything happened, it is buyer's problem and not the seller, because whether it happened at loading, whether it happened after loading, whether it happened on the way, please note, it is Ex Works. So the minute it is delivered, the minute it is on ground, it is delivered. The risk is transferred from the seller to the buyer. All right. So transfer of risk at that point is very, very important under Ex Works Incoterm rules. Let's look at this next point. A4B4, carriage. Do understand the Incoterm. In the Incoterm, the word carriage refers to the main mode of transport which is used from the seller's premise or the seller's country to the buyer's country. If it's within the international, if it is within the state, it is from the seller's premises to the buyer premises. Now, in case of Ex Works, there is no obligation of the seller to do any contract of carriage because seller technically has not to deliver him anywhere. The seller has to deliver in his own premises. So the contract of carriage doesn't play a role at all because there is no transport involved from the seller's perspective. So the seller has no role in or no obligation as far as contract of carriage is concerned. But because buyer has to send the truck, buyer has to send the vehicle, buyer has to send the transport, he has to send the carriage, it could be requirement of the buyer to understand what is the quantity, quality or size of the packaging details, the weight, so that he can accordingly send the vehicle. So it is, however, seller's responsibility that if buyer requests, buyer asks, then at the buyer's request, cost and risk. Please remember, at the buyer's request, cost and risk, provide information related to transport or security. Now, let me give you an example. What do I mean by this? Imagine you have a factory which is on top of a hill and it is an Ex Works contract. And there is a condition that the truck can only enter from midnight 9 p.m. to morning 6 a.m. And that too, you need a permission for the transport to allow. Okay. Now, you don't have to contract for a carriage, but the buyer has to send the truck. So if, first of all, if buyer requests you and if buyer asks you that, is there anything, so you can provide him an information that, listen, at this because it's an Ex Works and this warehouse, it has at this place, the arrangement to pick up by truck is between only 9 p.m. to 6 a.m. and for which you will have to have a permission which will be issued by the local, let's say, transport officer. If the buyer requests you, then at buyer's cost and the risk that if the authority rejects, then it is their problem. If it accepts, it's their problem. You don't have any obligation. You can, at the buyer's request, apply for that permission locally. And once you get it, you can give it to the buyer, and then the buyer can send the truck. But this exercise of obtaining the security clearance or the transport related permission, it is at the buyer's request, buyer's risk, and buyer's cost. If buyer says, no, I don't need help, I have a transport agent, he will do the needful, he will manage it. Fantastic, great, don't worry about it. It's his problem, his headache. So as a seller, you have no obligation to contract for the carriage. As a buyer, the buyer can decide to contract a carriage, meaning hire an agency, a transport agency to get the truck moving and the goods to pick up from your premises and get it, or he can have his own vehicle sent to you. Now, please understand, it could be his own vehicle or contract, and this is why you understand that the Incoterm rules can actually be used for either domestic or international business in sale of goods from a B2B perspective. So it need not necessarily be only international, but it can also be domestic, where you can use, but obviously two things, it has to be a business to business transaction and it has to be sale of goods. Then you can use Incoterms even in domestic. So in that case, you could have the buyer having his own vehicle to be used for collecting the goods. It is up to the buyer. You have no role, you have no issue, you have no obligation. The buyer also has no issue, no obligation. He does not have to tell you, the seller, this is what I'm going to do. It doesn't matter. He has to bring the vehicle, he has to get collecting a vehicle and collect the goods. Whether it is his own or he is contracted doesn't matter to either of the parties. A5B5, insurance. Insurance of the goods, mainly for the transport of the journey from the seller to the buyer's place for any damage, loss, or risk of any mishap. As far as X Works is concerned, because it is seller who is providing the goods at the doorstep of himself, the risk of the seller is terminated the minute it is handed over to the buyer in his own factory, which means there is no risk or loss which is going to happen to the seller at all. We just took that example where the loading was happening inside the seller's premises, but the problem or the risk was of the buyer and not of the seller. Hence, there is no obligation of the seller to take any insurance. However, it is if buyer wants, he can get the insurance, and for which, if any information, if any detail has to be provided, if any cost has to be worked out, at the request, risk, and cost of the buyer, seller can do the needful. Does buyer compulsory need to take insurance? No, there is no obligation. Buyer doesn't think that the insurance is required, or buyer may have a separate, a global insurance or a domestic insurance already in place. He doesn't need to have a separate insurance. There is no obligation for a compulsory insurance from the buyer's perspective as well. So neither the seller nor the buyer have an obligation of insurance in case of X Works is concerned. But do remember that in case of any loss or damage, it is that A2, A3 and B3 which will decide that if the loss or damage has happened before the delivery, it is the risk of the seller. If it has happened after the delivery, it is the risk of the buyer. A6 is delivery document or proof of delivery. Now, in case of X Works, please understand this. As far as the Incoterm rules are concerned, it is no obligation of the seller to provide any proof of delivery to the buyer. So, as per the contract, if 23rd of March is the delivery date, it is the seller obligation to keep the goods ready at the named place, which is his factory, the 100 cartons. And there is no requirement to prove it to the buyer. The buyer's carriage or buyer's vehicle will come and take the delivery. When the buyer's vehicle come and take the delivery, in fact, it is the buyer who is responsible And it is the buyer who must provide to the seller the appropriate evidence that he is taking the delivery of the goods. So it is the buyer's responsibility to offer you an acknowledgement or a proof or a document which says that yes, I have taken the delivery. I'll give you a very loose but a little comparison or a little metaphor to understand this concept of the buyer giving the delivery or somebody giving the delivery, delivery or proof of delivery. I'm sure many of you must have sent cargo or goods by or samples via various courier, international couriers, DHL, those companies, right? Now, when they come to your office and pick up the sample, it's almost like X works, right? So let's say the buyer has already arranged for DHL or FedEx. When you hand over, you don't take the signature on the letter or document saying, oh, you have taken the delivery. It is the other way around. The DHL or the FedEx gives you an acknowledgement, a receipt saying so-and-so from to so-and-so documents or package or whatever 1 kg box, and he signs and gives it to you. Though that acknowledgement is also acting as your airway bill to track and trace, but basically it's an acknowledgement. It's the proof which is given to you by the buyer's representative or by the transporter who has taken the delivery of the goods. The key understanding here you have to understand is that in XWorks is the person who is taking the delivery is offering you the acknowledgement, is offering you the proof. In our case, in XWorks, person who is going to take the delivery is the buyer's representative. So it is ensured that the buyer is going to give you the proof of delivery or proof of document, which you will get to make sure that the goods have been delivered as an acknowledgement that the buyer has taken the delivery. Now, this is what is there in policy. This is what is there in the law. That is what is there in the rule. However, the practical acceptance or practical practice is that the sellers will create a invoice or a document which obviously is created because he has to give. They will take acknowledgement of the driver on that invoice. Fair enough. Please take it. Go ahead. There is nobody who can stop you doing that. So you can certainly take an acknowledgement of the driver or the person who has come to pick up the goods. Please remember, the minute you have acknowledgement from the buyer's side, that is the proof that the goods have been taken the delivery, and they are confirmed that there are 100 cartons, your obligation is to deliver until X works, that is name place of delivery. 100 cartons आपने deliver कर दिया, उसका एक acknowledgement है, yes, there are 100 cartons, matter ends there. Did the buyer get 100 cartons safely, or he got 98 cartons correctly and 2 cartons damaged? That 2 cartons damaged is his problem, not yours. You have to pack it properly. Maybe there's an issue with the product and the quality. That is part of the contract. Because please remember, Incoterms doesn't deal with whether you have sent the right goods or not. That's your obligation, but that's done and dealt with the contract and not with Incoterms. So the delivery is completed the minute you have done it as per A3B3 or A2B through where the delivery was to be done, and the risk of any loss or mishap is of the buyer. So if you have packed it, if you have given 100 cartons up to the delivery spot, whether the buyer gets 100 cartons intact or he gets 98 or 95, that will not be there. That's not your concern, at least in XWorks. All right. So delivery document or proof of delivery is the buyer's obligation. Incoterms 2020 created an entire new sub-rule for export-import documentations and export-import clearance. So A7B7 talks about export-import related documentation and the procedure and the process. Because it is XWorks, let me start by putting it up into B7. So B7 says wherever applicable. And why it is wherever applicable? Because if it is domestic sale, then there's no export import, right? Documentation. So wherever applicable, it is up to the buyer. I'll repeat, it is up to the buyer to carry out and pay. So it is the obligation as well as the cost on the buyer for doing the export clearance, meaning the clearance in the seller's country, transit clearance, and import clearance. So it is up to the buyer who has to do export, transit, and import clearance. Now, what are those formalities? They include formalities like export, transit, and import licensing. They include security clearance or basically custom clearance. They include any pre-shipment inspection or any other official authorization or licensing requirement for exporting country, transit, or importing country. All three, Sara Kuch, everything is the job of the buyer. Seller, what has to do? Seller has not just to assist, offer his assistance. If there are some document which the buyer wants and the buyer asks for it, if buyer asks for it, then the seller must provide. If that document is to be required and the seller has to get it, for which there is a cost, then please understand that cost is borne by the buyer because it is at the buyer's request, risk, and expenses. If let's say there is a requirement of some license to be taken and it can only be taken in name of the seller, then it is at the buyer's request that the seller will apply for the license at the buyer's risk of getting it or getting it rejected. So whatever it is in X works, export, import, both formalities, or export, transit, and import, all the three formalities is to be done by the buyer and buyer alone. Checking, packing, marking. Obviously, the goods have to be checked, packed, and marked, or checked and packed. As far as checking is concerned, meaning A, whether you are giving the same goods which are asked for the contract. Have you giving the same quantity? If each carton has to have 100 pieces, quality, size, whatever it is, as per the contract. So it is the seller, it is your responsibility to do and pay for all the cost of operations like checking, quantity, counting, weighing, measuring, and make sure that they are correctly delivered as per A2. So your problem is not that the buyer gets it or not. Your problem is that have I delivered it as per A2? In Xworks, it is in the factory. If at the factory you have delivered it correctly, your life is set. You don't have to worry about whether the buyer gets it correctly or not, technically. Obviously, our goal is not that I want to deliver it and then whether buyer gets it or not is not my problem. Obviously, we want business. So we will make sure that it gets appropriately done till the buyers received it. But the aim is, or the requirement is, that you should give it appropriately, correctly, in the right quantity, right size, right working until the delivery spot. In terms of packaging, you must pack the goods as a seller, which is best and appropriate for the transport. So you should know how the goods are going to be transported to the buyer's country or buyer's premise. It may be packed as per the contract requirement or specific details which are part of the contract. Or if it is generally accepted norm that the goods are not to be packed, then that can be taken into account. But as far as packaging is concerned, Incoterms remains open and it basically looks at the contract of what are the requirements which are there, including the marking on the packaging. So it's the contract which will decide. But if there's nothing, then at least as a seller, you have to make sure that you pack which is comfortable, which is the best suitable for the transport. So if you know that the goods are going to be transported by air, you cannot have a very long packing because then it cannot go into the aircraft. Or you cannot have a volumetric large thing because then it will be very heavy, very difficult for the aircraft to take it. You know it is going by sea and there is rains and there could be a water seepage, and maybe you want to make sure that the goods are packed appropriately so the water damage cannot happen. So A8, B8. B8, buyer doesn't do anything in terms of packaging. There's no obligation because buyer is the one who is going to get the goods. So fantastically, buyer has to accept this. There is no obligation as far as buyer is concerned. Until Incoterms 2010, like you could see in ASAP from A1 to B8, wherever the costs are required, there is mentioned that, somebody will pay. So if the seller has to pay, that's seller's cost. Buyer has to pay, it's buyer cost. So everywhere it is mentioned. In case of, let's say, export documentation, it said the buyer will do and pay for it. So, it's mentioned. But if I want to understand all the cost implication at one place, this was not available at some other previous Incoterms. In this Incoterms 2020, they have amended and they have created a sub rule called A9B9, allocation of costs. So when a buyer or a seller, let me put it like this. Let's say when Dr. Nigam, who is an exporter based out of India, offers a product at $100 X works, and I am the buyer sitting in Australia and want to understand that apart from $100, what am I supposed to bear the cost of? I don't need to go and check on each of the Incoterms. I can straight away go to B9 as a buyer. See, I am supposed to pay for all costs relating to the goods that have been from the time they have been delivered. So from the time they have been delivered, so from the time it is at this factory ready, cost incurred on the goods have to be to my account. Second, if I've asked Dr. Nigam to do anything related to carriage, anything to do related insurance, anything to do related export import, then the expenses which he's incurred, I have to reimburse any cost incurred by him. So that's the second cost. Third, in case there are any duties, taxes, export clearance charges, anything at the exporting country, transit country, or importing country, that has to be paid by me. And last, if there are any additional costs because of I not taking the delivery and the seller has to incur cases, those costs also have to be paid by me. So this gives me a clear picture. What am I supposed to do? What is Dr. Nigam's $100 including? Dr. Nigam's $100 from his perspective are all costs until they are delivered at the delivery place, which is his X factory. Imagine if Dr. Nigam had two factories. He had two factories. And obviously the address is of only one factory. And some goods are there at his second factory. The bringing those goods to make it delivered at the factory, which is from where I'm supposed to take the delivery, that is his problem because his cost, because the goods have to be delivered at this place. So all costs up to delivery are to be paid by the seller. All costs after the delivery are to be paid by the buyer, plus all the expenses which are incurred in B9. So A9, B9 gives you a clear picture of what costs are included by whom. Finally, the last sub-rule, which is A10, B10. A10, B10 is talking about notices. Don't get scared. This is not talking about legal notices. This is about information. This is about informing. I say this, and since we are all talking to I'm talking to an Indian audience, I can use a little bit of Hindi and tell them, this businesses should not be chori chori chupke chupke. The seller and the buyer should know when the delivery is, when I'm supposed to go and do it. Now, typically in a contract, either there could be a specific date, but generally it is a period. First week of December, last week of March, mid-January. So that's a period. So when it's a period in the contract, it's the buyer who has a prerogative, or the buyer who has a right to decide the date within the period. So if let's say last week of March will be anything from 25th to 31st, which date you will come and pick it up. So buyer has to send a notice. The Incoterm is silent about the method of notice, but at least legally and internationally accepted is an email, not any of the social media chats of WhatsApp or iChat or any of those methods. So an email should be good enough. So an intimation by the buyer to the seller that this is the agreed date where I will come and pick it up. Now that date should be a sufficient notice. I cannot be sending him today at evening 10 o'clock and say tomorrow morning I'm going to pick it up, because that's within the agreed date. No. So there's something called a sufficient notice where I will tell the seller that on this date I agree to pick up the goods. If there's a specific date, meaning there is already in the contract date is very specific, 25th of March, then on 25th of March, unless the buyer or the seller have agreed to change the date, the seller is obligated to keep the goods ready on 25th of March, and the buyer is obligated to collect the goods on 25th of March. Then further, no requirement of notices. So you have to be very clear. Either you have a specific date, then there's no requirement of notice. But if there's a agreed period where the buyer has to determine the date, it's the buyer who has to inform, and obviously the seller and the buyer must agree on the date that the goods have been ready to be taken to delivery. So it is information sharing. It should not be, in the silent zone, and you don't know the goods are ready, they are so-called delivered, and the buyer doesn't know about it, or the buyer has sent the truck and you are not ready because you were not aware that the buyer was supposed to collect it today. So in both instances, you have to be very careful. So the notices have to be provided. Again, as I said, the method of notice is not very defined in Incoterm. So it can be independent choice, but ideally speaking, email should work well when we are talking about a global business. All right. So I hope you are clear with Xworks. If yes, give me a okay or yes on the chat, at least for people who might can get a response on the Zoom meeting. I'm sorry, guys, I'm not connected on YouTube, so I'm unable to get a response from YouTube, but I'm sure the team from Drip Capital is checking that out. So in case if you are connected via YouTube, do leave a message or a chat on the chat on the YouTube, and then somebody at the Drip Capital team will be looking at that as well. And in case if there is something which needs to be answered, we will take that as well. All right. Now, this is the base of our Incoterm as we've planned from moving from left to right, from the seller to the buyer. As you could see, this gives you the least obligation, bare minimum obligation, bare minimum cost as a seller, right? Now, we are going to add further and further, and we're going to look at various other Incoterm rules. Do note, the ones which are going to be repeated, the ones which are same are not going to be repeated. So we are not going to take all of 10 again, because then it's a repeat of what we've already done. So let's start with the second rule, which is talking about free carrier. Now please understand, you'll have to keep that background of at the back of Xworks, which is the base rule. And we will now see what are the changes in the free carrier. This is a new rule, new set, new technically A1 to A10 and B1 to B10, which may have some repeat also, but there are some which are new, and that is key element. A1, B1 remains the same general obligation. The seller has to give the goods and the invoice. The buyer has to agree to pay for money. The point is, where does the delivery happen? So in case of delivery, the seller is required to deliver the goods to the carrier, okay, to the carrier or to any other person nominated by the buyer at the named point, which is agreed on the agreed date or within the agreed period as per the notice. So first of all, the seller कैसे delivery होगी? Either he has to give the goods to the carrier. Carrier means a transport, a vehicle or a transporter or a company who is into taking the goods, or to any other person nominated by the buyer. So it may be somebody XYZ at some place, and that named point, which is the named place of delivery, which is the FCA term, FCA free carrier named place of delivery. So at the named place of delivery, and it is to be done at the agreed date or within the agreed period as per the notice. Now, when is the delivery going to get completed? And this is important. In FCA, there are two delivery spots. In Xworks, there was only one, but in FCA, there are two spots. Number one, if it is at the seller's premises like Xworks. So if it is your premise, your place, then the delivery is set to be completed when the goods are on, that is, goods are loaded on the means of transport provided by the buyer. The buyer provides the transport, but what is now added? Loading is added as your obligation. Only when the loading is done on that vehicle, the obligation gets completed or the delivery gets completed. If go back to our example of 95 carton being loaded and the 96 carton being loaded and getting the goods falling off, if it was an FCA, if it was an FCA transaction and not an Ex Works transaction, then the risk of that damage would have been of, okay, I'm getting 2 responses, 3, 4. Yes, it is, would have been, if it was an FCA, then the answer would be seller. So just by changing one Incoterm, we are adding an obligation to the seller to load the goods on the collecting vehicle if it is at the seller's premises. So if the FCA, the name place of delivery, is at the same premises like Ex Works, then you are adding the obligation of loading, obligation cost, everything. Now, the second delivery spot, it could either be here, either be somewhere. So what is the second delivery spot? The second spot, if it is any other place, then if it is any other place which is nominated by the buyer, then the delivery will be complete when goods are ready, placed, ready at the disposal of the buyer or the carrier or any other person. So if it's the carrier, then it's the shipping line or the airline or the truck guy or the person who has been nominated by the buyer on the seller's means of transport ready for unloading. So let us understand this. Let's say the buyer has nominated an airline, the carrier. Okay. So it is the airport at which you are going to be delivering it. And as the carrier is the airline which has been nominated by the buyer under FCA. Now, where does the delivery happen? You as the seller will have to keep the goods ready, arrange for a transport. Please understand, it's not the carriage. Carriage is the airline. Okay, so you will arrange for a transport vehicle, which is the truck. You will load the goods in the truck. The truck will go from your factory to the airport. At the airport, it will enter the airport, and when it reaches the airline hub or the airline terminal, it will be handed over to the carrier by making it ready. That means the truck driver will come back, open the door and say, sir, unload it. So the minute the truck door is being ready for the disposal, ready for the buyer to take the delivery, unloading is to be done by the buyer, not by you. So either the carrier or if it is, let's say, somebody's warehouse, then the buyer's nominated person, either of that, it will be done by, or the unloading will be done by the buyer, not by you. The risk and the cost of adding the goods on the truck, the transport going to the airport, and from the airport, delivering it, it is added to the seller. But unloading the premise, the carrier premise or the nominated person's premise is of the buyer. So you've added some cost, you've added some risk, you've added some obligation to the seller. All right. So that's how the delivery is happening. There are 2 spots of delivery, and depending on where the delivery is in the nomenclature, you will write FCA, named place of delivery. Until this, we are only talking about this. Now, who will do the export clearance and the import clearance? In Ex Works, everything was done by the buyer. However, it is obviously a little challenging that the buyer has to do, or the seller has to do in some cases, the obligations of some other countries' customs and legal procedure, which is not always possible or not always effectively done. But it is there. In Ex Works, no choice. Ex Works, the buyer has to do everything. But in FCA, and in fact, from FCA onwards to whatever Incoterms we will discuss, until I tell you the difference, this is going to remain, and it is an almost 50-50 where the seller is required to do the export clearance which includes export licensing, export procedure, authorization, everything related to export in this country. And the buyer is required to do the transit and the import formality. And both of them, the seller and the buyer, have to assist in each other in case of any requirement. So if, let's say, as an exporter, I require buyer country some import license, then the buyer has to give me that. If as a buyer, when he is doing some import clearance, he requires some export license, export documentation, I have to provide the document. But the cost of clearance, the obligation, the procedure of export is to be done by the seller. The transit and the import is to be done by buyer. So it was almost 50-50%. All right. Now, please understand this from the perspective of even when the goods are delivered at the seller's premises. So though FCA, the risk of the goods have been transferred to the seller at from the seller to the buyer at the factory. So if it was FCA, the factory of the seller, let's say the seller is, let me put some lady out there so it is fair enough. So let's say Miss Dwani Zaveri is there as a part of our attendee list. So Miss Dwani is the seller and it is X Works delivered at her factory. So when I send the truck, she loads it into the truck, the delivery is complete. Now the risk is mine. My truck will go to the port. But when the goods reach the port, the custom clearance, the obligation of doing the export clearance still remains to the seller. So it's Dwani's problem. It is her obligation to file the custom documents, to make sure the export clearance is correctly done, and to make sure that all the export formalities are completed, and then the goods are handed over back to the buyer for all the procedure further. So export clearance cost, obligation is the still of the seller. All right. So it's the seller's obligation for export clearance. It is the buyer's obligation for import clearance. I hope I'm clear till this, and more or less the other rules are the same for the FCA, and hence we are only specifying the changed ones. A very, very quick question. I hope most of you will easily be able to answer, so then we can take the next Incoterm. Is in this transaction where goods are being FCA, they are picked up at the factory itself of Ms. Zaveri, the seller in India. The goods are loaded on the truck is on the way to the seaport, and in between there's an accident of the truck and there's a damage on the goods. Who bears the risk? Is it the seller or the buyer? It's an FCA term. FCA term, the delivery is at the factory of the seller. The delivery is at the factory of the seller. Yes. So please, people who have said seller, no guys, the delivery is completed when the goods are loaded by Miss Zaveri on my truck. The risk of goods is mine as a buyer. So it is the buyer's risk of the accident. If it reaches properly to the port, it is still Ms. Dwani's risk or obligation to do the custom clearance. But apart from that, the risk of any damage, loss, mishap is of the buyer in case of FCA, where the goods are loaded at the factory. All right. So that's FCA for you. Let's go to the next one. Free alongside ship. FAS. And the Incoterms, the syntax says named port of shipment. Do remember the two terminologies which I am going to tell you. Wherever in Incoterm we refer to the term called named port of shipment, we are talking about port of loading. And wherever we are reading named port of destination, we are saying port of discharge. Okay. So port of shipment is port of loading. Port of destination is port of discharge. Free alongside ship, if you see at the right side top corner, it is only C, because this mode, this Incoterm can technically be only used for C. And the reason being is because the delivery spot is very, very specific. And what is the delivery? The delivery spot says it is the seller who must deliver the goods by placing it alongside a vessel nominated by the buyer. Alongside the vessel. So it doesn't say alongside a transport. It doesn't say alongside any carrier. It says specifically a vessel, which means you will have to deliver the goods when alongside the ship. If you deliver it alongside the truck, it is not FAS because it is free alongside ship. You cannot do that. So it is very, very important that the goods, and this Incoterm can only be used for sea shipment because it is free alongside ship. So when your ship is on the port and when you leave the cargo next to it, the delivery is complete. All risks, all cost until the delivery is of the seller. Now, it doesn't matter whether it is loaded at the factory, loaded at any place, everything up to the delivery alongside the ship is of the seller. So it is the seller's responsibility to arrange for the truck. It is the seller's responsibility to make sure the truck reaches the port correctly. The export clearance procedure is already done by the seller because that's already been discussed. And then bring it to the port where it is next to or alongside the ship. Until this point, all cost, all risk, all obligation is of the seller. The minute the good is alongside the ship, the risk is now transferred, shifted from the seller to the buyer. So it is when the goods are alongside the ship, until that point, the risk is of the seller. The minute it is alongside the ship, the risk is of the buyer. I don't know many of you do remember this, and I'm not sure how many of you are from in and around western side of the India, but I'm sure you're connected across India or maybe across the world now. But let me give you an example, and I want your answers if you can shoot it out on the chat. So, you know, at a port at Nhava Sheva in Mumbai, let's assume that your goods were under FAS, and let's say a friend, Mr. Kishore Bhatt had an order, and Kishore Bhatt had an order at FAS terms. The buyer had nominated the vessel, and the vessel was supposed to come to Nhava Sheva port. So Mr. Bhatt was supposed to keep the goods alongside the ship. So on 23rd of March, the vessel docked in and he left the goods alongside the ship. The goods were not yet loaded because there was some unloading happening. The planning was to be done, let's say today at 4:26 it was there. So the planning was that the shipping line would start loading the goods at about 1 o'clock in the night. At about 5 o'clock, another ship which was docking into the port dashed with the port, and it actually collided with the containers and the goods which were left on the port, and it damaged the goods of our dear friend Mr. Kishore Bhatt. Now goods are damaged, goods are, you know, there's a loss, maybe a couple of them fell in the sea. My question to you is, whose risk of loss of damage it is in an FAS where goods are not loaded but they are alongside the ship, seller or the buyer? Yes, I think I got most of the answers correct. It is the buyer because it is alongside the ship. All right, it is alongside the ship. It doesn't matter whether it is loaded. When it is loaded, it is alongside the ship. It is the buyer who will bear the risk. Now, as a buyer, obviously, I am very vulnerable. I don't know whether Nhava Sheva has proper security, proper thing, or whether if it is not Nhava Sheva, it could be Kandla, Mundra, Chennai, Calcutta. I'm not aware. Based out of, let's say, South Africa, I don't know how your good safety, the safety standards are. So I want to be very sure. So then in that case, I may want to go for the next Incoterm, which is FOB, free on board. This is one of the most commonly used Incoterm by everybody, including Indian exporters, Indian importers. Very, very effective. And I'll tell you the reason why it is, but one of the most commonly used Incoterm. Please note FOB stands for free on board and not foot over bridge. So it is free on board. Name port of shipment. The port of shipment is the port of loading. So FOB Navasheva Seaport, India. FOB Kandla Seaport, India. FOB Chennai Seaport, India. It will only be C because the answer is the delivery is when the goods are on board, when the goods are placed on board of the vessel nominated by the buyer. So buyer has nominated the vessel, buyer has contacted the vessel, and the goods are on board. So now the goods being alongside and the vessel being there is not enough. Until the goods are on board, the delivery is not complete. And once the goods are on board, the delivery is complete. Let us just quickly take that example. If the damage, the risk, the problem which happened in the FAS transaction of to Mr. Kishore Bhatt, what if Bhatt Sahab had a contract under FOB terms? Then whose risk it would have been, seller or the buyer? Yes, just see the difference here, guys. From the minute we change that Incoterm, instead of FAS to FOB, the risk changes. So as a buyer, I do have a choice. If I'm not aware and I'm not sure, it will be of the seller, because it is not loaded on Anand, it is not loaded on the vessel. The risk would have been of the seller. All right. So it is, once it is loaded, anything happened. Now, let us take another example. The goods were loaded on the vessel and the accident happened and it dashed the ship and then the container fell down. Now whose risk it is, seller or the buyer? Yes. So it is that moment. That's why I'm saying delivery is all about that time. Exactly. Is point pe delivery khatam ho gaya. The seller risk is transferred to the buyer. So it's about that point of time. Who bears what obligations? Who bears what cost? As a seller, all cost until delivery. Meaning what? A, you will bear the cost of the goods. You will take the goods from your factory to the port. You are responsible to the export clearances, documentation, obligations, everything at your cost. You are responsible to take it to the port and you are responsible to load it on the vessel. Until you do all that, cost, obligation, risk is of the seller. The minute you have done this, the risk is transferred from the seller to the buyer. The obligations of everything from that point is of the buyer. Why this is one of the most comfortable thing, or most comfortable or most popular Incoterm? Because if you look at a transaction, imaginary, especially in an international transaction, imaginarily, this is making a transaction 50-50. That as a seller, you take care of everything in your country. As a buyer, I will take care of everything in my country and outside your country. So imaginarily, it makes a transaction half-half. And that's why most of people prefer an FOB transaction. In India, we prefer exports under FOB also because for all our export benefits and incentives, the terms or the valuation is done on FOB basis. So that also gives you an ease of working with various incentives where you can get an FOB value easily derived. So FOB is free on board, one of the most common Incoterm. Are we okay till this? Give me a yes, no. Are we clear till this? I know a lot of questions are there. We will answer that at the end because most of you will get to know your answers yourself as we will move further to the other Incoterms as well. Perfect. Great. The reason I asked you this question is because we are now moving to C terms, the terms which start with alphabet C. And trust me, C terms are confusing terms. They're not that simple and not easy how it is. So let us look at this first, the syntax. And this is where the confusion starts. It says CFR, cost and freight. For all those people who have been regularly into export or regularly into business internationally and using Incoterms, this is the same term which was earlier called as C and F. Then it was changed to CNF and now it is called CFR. All right. So they're not different. They are one and the same, but it is the terminology has changed with the alphabets. So it is now CFR, cost and freight. Then it says name port of destination, meaning the port in which of country where you are destination. So let's say if I'm exporting to Dubai, it will be CFR Jebel Ali. If it is going to Sri Lanka, CFR Colombo, CFR Johannesburg, CFR Felixstowe, CFR New York, Incoterms 2020. Now my question, and let me, ask you and tell you that try to think about it before you answer, because it is a confusing term. If it is a CFR transaction, which is cost and freight, where the name port of destination, let's say, is CFR Colombo, Sri Lanka, Incoterms 2020, where will the delivery happen? Because please understand, the delivery is going to change the risk from the seller to the buyer. Where will the delivery happen? Where will the delivery get completed? Until what point is the seller supposed to deliver? All right. Fantastic. So many of you, yes, I think I've got a couple of people who said the right answers. Most of you have got into the confusion because we carried forward what we were discussing since an hour ago. So most of you, whoever said place of destination, Colombo seaport, port at destination, unfortunately, it is wrong. And that's why I'm saying it's confusing. All right. Now, please listen carefully why it is confusing and why it is so. Though it is port of destination, until now we were doing this only, but that's why C terms are confusing. So CFR, the delivery is when goods are placed on board of the vessel. So the delivery is exactly at the same place of FOB, on port of loading. So if the goods are going from Nhava Sheva to Colombo, the minute the goods are on board at Nhava Sheva, delivery is complete, risk is transferred, khatam. Arre? Then why it is called CFR? Because that is FOB. So please understand, until this point, we were carrying forward the cost and the obligations, the cost and the risk almost together level. So wherever the termination of cost happens, risk happens, it is both together. But here, from the C terms, we are saying the risk is terminating at one place, which is on board at Nhava Sheva, on board at Kandla, on board at the port of loading. But you are paying, the seller is paying some additional cost. So what is he additionally paying? He is additionally paying the freight. So now it is the seller who is supposed to contract for the carriage, pay the cost of the freight, and to tell the buyer until what he is paid the freight. That means he has paid freight up to the name port of destination. So when I'm exporting to Dubai, it could be either to CFR Jebel Ali or CFR Sharjah. So when I've said CFR Sharjah in Incoterms 2020, I am telling the buyer, I have paid for the freight from Nhava Sheva seaport to Sharjah seaport. That's it. The risk, I repeat, the risk of the buyer starts at the delivery spot, which is on board at Nhava Sheva. Sir, whoever has the risk has to pay for the insurance if you want. The reason I'm not discussing insurance in any of the Incoterm is because it is up to the person who has the insurable interest either to insure it or not. The risk of the seller is from his factory until he loads it on the Indian port. The risk terminates, and it is the risk of the buyer from the time the goods are loaded until it is delivered. So it is up to the buyer if he wants to insure it or not. There is no requirement of insurance at this point of time. So the insurance of the transit, insurance of anything is up to the buyer. If the seller wants to insure his domestic leg, it is his problem, not the Incoterm issue. It is not compulsory. It is not the problem anywhere. So on board at port of loading is the place where the risk gets terminated. The cost works little further by payment of freight. So simply put, this is a prepaid transaction. It is a transaction where you are paying the freight on your buyer's behalf, that you are saying, okay, I will pay the freight. Two advantages I see in this compared to FOB. Number one, in FOB, the delivery is on board of the vessel, which the buyer has nominated. Now, whatever reason, let's say the goods are ready, but the vessel is not come. The vessel is going to come after 3 days. And if let's say the loading is not happening, until the goods are not loaded on that ship which the buyer has nominated, your risk doesn't get transferred. So it is that much time the risk increases. Second, obviously the freight cost, which is the landed cost to the buyer. But if you can negotiate a better freight, then that's one advantage. And number two, when you contract for the freight and the carriage, when your goods are ready, you can contract for any shipping line which you feel best. So today, if my goods are ready at the port, I have a vessel which is sailing tomorrow, I can immediately load it tonight and I am out of the risk. It is on board that vessel. So I can decide for whatever it is. Again, my risk, my cost until the goods are delivered is of the seller. From the point the goods are delivered until anything further, except for the freight meaning from the port until the port of discharge is borne by the seller. Unloading, any charges at the importing country, any charges of the custom clearances, duties, taxes, damages, anything at the importing end, everything is of the buyer. I am only paying an additional cost of freight. I'm only paying the additional cost of freight. If I have to simply put, very, very simple, the simplest example or simplest way to explain you FRGHT, sorry, I'm typing something, is FOB plus sea freight is equal to CFR. So the seller contracts for the freight, contracts for the carriage, and that becomes CFR. The risk, the obligation is already in the same place on board the vessel at the port of loading. All right. So that's going to be CFR. I hope now you are clear with the C Incoterm, which is the confusing Incoterm, the first one. CPT, carriage paid to. The FOB, the CFR were only used for C. So there's a carriage paid to, a similar Incoterm for all modes or multimodal. Where does the delivery happen? Please now see, it says name, place of destination. Now, please understand this. This is typically for air, road, rail, or multimodal, where let's say the cargo is delivered. Let's say I'm exporting goods to Nepal, and I have an order from India, from Bombay, to deliver the goods to Kathmandu city in Nepal. And it's a CPT transaction. So what it means is carriage paid to. Please understand. But the carriage paid to means I am going to pay for the cost of the transport. Where is the delivery going to happen? The delivery, which is going to transfer my risk from the seller to the buyer, is going to happen when I hand it over to the carrier. When I hand it over the goods to the carrier. In this case, the carrier is the road transport. So let's say a truck from the road transport agency called Sugam Parivahan comes and picks up the goods from my factory. The minute I hand over the goods to Sugam Parivahan, whom I have contracted, by the way, for whom I am paying the freight, my delivery is complete. From Bombay to Nepal in Kathmandu, the freight is paid. But if let's say from Bombay to Kathmandu and on the way there was an accident and some 4 cartons got damaged, whose risk it is? Seller or the buyer? The risk is of the buyer, not of the seller. Hello, Mr. Kumar, Mr. Sharma. It is buyer, not seller. All right. Yes. Because the delivery is complete, I am only paying the cost additional. Please understand the C terms, the confusing terms are because the delivery happens at a different place, the cost is up to a different place. So you are paying additional cost. You're paying the cost for the buyer, but the risk, you're not taking it on your head. So risk is still of the buyer at the place where it is going to be delivered. In this case, when I hand it over to the carrier. So let's say if the goods were going by air, Bombay, New York. The minute I hand it over to the airline, say I am taking a British Airways. So the minute I hand over the goods to British Airways, the risk is transferred from Bombay and from the seller to the buyer. Until I hand it over to the British Airways, the risk is mine. The minute I hand it over to British Airways, the risk is transferred from the seller to the buyer, and anything happening is to the buyer's front. Now, and I've said CPT, let's say New York port. So I'm saying I'm only paid up to New York port, boss. From New York to take it to your place, though it is a multimodal, that freight you have to pay. The buyer is in New Jersey. I have not paid that freight. I am only paid up to New York port. But let's say I have a buyer in a small African country called Malawi. It's a landlocked country. And I have to route it through a port. Nearest port is Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. But I'm saying it's CPT Malawi. Meaning my goods will probably leave Ethiopia, and from Ethiopia it will go by road to Malawi, and then in Malawi I will hand it over to that destination. So it's a multimodal transport. But the payment of freight is done by me, but the risk is borne by the buyer, because the risk is the minute I hand it over to the carrier. In this case, let's say the carrier is a shipping line. So the minute I hand it over to the shipping line, the risk is transferred from the seller to the buyer, and anything going wrong or misplaced is of the buyer. Do remember, in this case, all of these cases, the cost of export of process is of the seller. The cost of import process is of the buyer. Checking, packing, marking of the goods still remains the same. The other details remain exactly the same, the way it has been continued. Hence, we have taken only the differences which are part of the changes. Let's introduce you to the word I in the Incoterms. And by introducing to the I in the Incoterms, we come to the first one, which is called CIF, cost, insurance, and freight. And it is only for the C, and it says up to name port of destination. I'm sure by now you will be prepared and understand with the googlies which come under the C Incoterms. The delivery under CIF will be where? I have a goods going from Chennai seaport to Singapore. I have a goods going from Chennai seaport to Singapore under CIF. Where will be the delivery happening? Where will be the delivery of the goods? Okay, I'm getting exactly 50-50 answers. Chennai, Singapore, Chennai, Singapore, Chennai, Singapore, Chennai, Singapore. Wow, I don't need this. Oh, okay, I don't need the rhythm, guys. I need the answers. Friends, for all those who said Singapore, no, please understand. Confusing Incoterms, terms. The delivery will be, and people who said Chennai, I'm sorry, it is not a Chennai port. It is actually on board at Chennai. On the vessel, on board at Chennai port, the delivery will happen. So don't confuse, don't be saying just Chennai port, because you have to be very precise. It is not at Chennai port, it is delivery. The risk gets complete, transferred from seller to the buyer at Chennai port. Then why it is called CIF? Because you pay more, you pay something additional. So what do you pay? You pay for the freight. Right? So this is CFR, correct? Now, you also pay for insurance. You now additionally pay for insurance. Now, why so? So I think there were a couple of posts which people were asking, sir, what about insurance? Now, technically, as I said, this is an obligation which the seller and the buyer decides who has the risk. But when you are selling, you are buying goods, you typically also want some peace of mind, because you are not interested in the transaction getting bust. You want the buyer to get the goods properly. the buyer also wants the goods to come, and it wants to come safely. So for any reason, safety could be an issue or a doubt. You want to make sure that you insure it so that there is no problem. There is an option in the CFR where the buyer insure it, so effectively it is insured. But you cannot be with that question of if the buyer insures. You want the safety of the goods, no matter what, so that the buyer either gets the goods or he can claim the money. Please remember, the risk is already transferred from the seller to the buyer on board of the port of loading. So you as a seller are going to only take an insurance in favor of the buyer. Please go back and see your insurance copy, CIF, whenever you're taking an insurance, the beneficiary is the buyer. And you are insuring from the port of loading to the port of destination. Yes, many buyers insist for additional, that is from your warehouse to buyer's warehouse. That is additional, that is not mandatory by law. The rule provides you that you will do the insurance from port of loading to port of destination, port to port. The rule complies you that you will compulsory do insurance of Institute Cargo Clause C, the lowest insurance, for a value of rupees 100, for the value of not rupees, for value of 110% of the invoice value. So whatever be your value of invoice, 110% should be the insurance taken minimum. You can do more, but minimum 110%. ICC Clause C, Institute Cargo Clause C, is the minimum insurance which you will be taking it up. So we have added insurance to this. Do remember, insurance, if anything is to be claimed by the buyer. Why? Because it is his risk in case of insurance, in case of any damage, because from the port of loading till the port of destination and further, from the point it is delivered, the risk is transferred from the seller to the buyer. So if I have to put it in a layman's term, FOB plus freight is CFR, CFR plus insurance is CIF. Similarly, we have CIP, carriage insurance paid to. Now this is no rocket science. It is CPT plus insurance. Now you are adding insurance to the carriage paid to. So the delivery is when you hand over the goods to the carrier. So the minute you hand over the goods to the truck guy at by Nepal example, or by the airline or by the shipping line, the goods are delivered. You are already contracting for the carriage in CPT. Now you're contracting for insurance. Until Incoterms 2010, both the insurance requirement as far as rules were concerned were same. But in 2020, CIP, carriage insurance paid to, that is up to the destination. This is warehouse to warehouse insurance. Here, you require to do a ICC Clause A, Institute Cargo Clause A, all risk covered, for a value which is 110% of invoice minimum. So 110% of the invoice value and ICC Clause A insurance is to be done. Do note that it is only and only in these two Incoterms where the word I is part of the Incoterm rules, where insurance is compulsory to be done as an obligation of the seller. No other Incoterm requires the seller or the buyer to compulsory do an insurance. It is on their wills and wish. So CIP is carriage paid to plus insurance. Again, please remember the other general basic rules which we continued to keep as it is remains with the seller and the buyer as it is. So whether it is the export-import clearances, the transit clearance remains export with the seller, import and transit with the buyer. Checking, packing, marking with the seller, it has to be done correctly. All costs up to delivery, all risk up to delivery is of the seller, all risks cost after delivery of the buyer, except in case of CIP, CIF, the cost of freight and insurance, which is to be borne by the seller. So we've completed the C Incoterms and we are now left with D Incoterms. If C were confusing, D are dangerous. Not dangerous in terms of any wrongdoing, dangerous in terms of the risk appetite. So the D terms, and as you can see, we have moved about 6, 7, 8 spaces towards the buyer. So it is going to give more and more obligations, more and more risks to the seller, and it will make buyer's life easier. Delivered at place, DAP, and see the terms, see the context. It says place of destination. So the delivery will now, what are we now changing? If you look at X Works, it was very close to the seller. Then it went little far up to the port, up to the warehouse. Then it went near the port alongside the ship. It went on the board. In CPT, CIPT, it went up to the carrier. In CIP, CIF, everywhere it was until the board. It was meaning at least it was at the end of our side. But now we are talking about the other side. So now the delivery B is now going to be at the destination. So the risk appetite is increasing. These are riskier than any other ones. So DAP, where does the delivery happen? The delivery happens when the seller delivers the goods by placing it at the disposal of the buyer in the arriving means of transport at the named place of destination, because buyer's country, ready for unloading. So now, instead of the X Works where the delivery was in the seller's premises, it will be at the buyer's destination, and the obligation of the seller is to deliver it at the buyer's named place of destination, ready for unloading. Unloading at the destination is the buyer's responsibility still. So what does the buyer have to do? Let's say I have in the list, I can see Mr. Anil Kumar. So let's say Mr. Kumar has got an order and the buyer is in New York and the terms are DAP. DAP, let's say it is said warehouse number 17, 6th Street, New York. So Mr. Kumar has to deliver. So when will the delivery get completed? When that risk will get transferred? All costs until the delivery is of the seller. All obligations up to the deliveries of the seller. So what Mr. Kumar has to do? He has to take the goods, load it onto a truck, take it to, let's say he's going by sea. So he'll take it to the port, do the export clearance, take it to the port, load it into the ship. The ship will go from, let's say, Nhava Sheva to New York, pay the freight, unload it, and then take it via truck to the named place of delivery, which is warehouse number 17, 6th Street, New York, and ready. He doesn't have to load it from the truck. Unloading will be done by the buyer. Two things which the buyer will do: unloading at the named place of destination, and at the New York, at US Customs, the import formalities, the duties and taxes will still be paid by the buyer. So under DAP, only two things which the buyer do. One is payment of duties and taxes, and number two, in import by the way, and number two is unloading at the named place of destination. Buyer will pay the duties, buyer will do the unloading. Rest everything is your risk, your cost, your obligation. Now, when the buyer is unloading, if he doesn't get 100 cartons appropriately, the goods are not correctly delivered. So you have to take care that all 100 are properly packed and you have a proper packaging, strapping, marking, everything done. Now you have the risk up to highest level. Let's move further. Delivered at place, unloaded. So now Mr. Kumar is not only going to deliver it at the premises of the buyer, that is warehouse number 17, 6th Street, New York. You will have to deliver it by unloading it at the named place of disposal. In short, buyer will only pay duties and taxes, rest everything is to be done, import duties and taxes, by the way, will be paid by the buyer. Rest everything is to be done by the seller. The risk until it is unloaded. I have a question. Our friend Mr. Anil Kumar has a DPU at New York, and he had about 100 cartons, or let's say 10 pallets. Let's put it like this: 10 pallets were there, and at the name place of destination where the buyer and the buyers in the US where he was unloading, when he was unloading via forklift, putting the pallets down, out of 10 pallets, 7 pallets got unloaded, and the 8th pallet, when he was unloading, there was some problem. It was not properly fixed, and the pallet fall off, and the goods were damaged. Whose risk of damage of the goods, seller or buyer? All right. I'm very happy that all of you have got the right answer. It is the seller. So I'm happy that whatever we are discussing is ideally being rightly understood by you. Fantastic. Thank you so very much. Yes, it is the seller who suffers the loss of risk or damage, because until it is delivered, and the delivery is by placing it on that ground. Jab tak rakha nahi, until you don't leave it on the ground, deliver it unloaded, the risk is of the seller. So the buyer only does only one thing. He will only pay for the duties and taxes of the goods. Obviously pays for the cost of the goods, which is obviously the part. But as far as the process is concerned, he's only going to pay the duties, import duties and taxes as far as goods are concerned. All right, we're coming to the last Incoterm, which is delivered duty paid. And just for a recap, I decided that I will make sure that I will read through or go through all the 10 sub rules once again, so that you have an understanding. If I have to simply put, this is an exactly opposite of X works, because it's the extreme other end. So if you recollect our X works correctly, you will be able to just put that into the right perspective on the reverse. Just turn it around. It is DDP. So let's look at the first one, A1B1, general obligation. The seller must provide the goods and a commercial invoice. The buyer must provide the price. Whether the documents are in electronic format or physical, it's as far as agreed in the agreement, or in the customary format, both is acceptable. Where does the delivery happen? In DDP, please understand, in DDP, the delivery is on the means of transport at the arriving place, at the name place of destination, on the arriving means of transport, ready for unloading. Unload nahi karna hai. You don't have to unload. Let me quickly ask you, I'm sure everybody will get the answer right. Quickly, if this is the delivery spot, ready for unloading at the name place of destination, which is the other Incoterm where the same delivery spot is? Which is an Incoterm having the same delivery spot? You don't have to unload it. Yes, it's DAP. Sandeep ji, it's not DPU. No, it is not DPU. DPU you have to unload it. It is DAP. So we are actually going one step back, but I'll tell you why we are going one step back, when though it is the last Incoterm and the extreme side. So delivery is without unloading at the name place of destination, which means what? That all costs, all risks, until it is delivered in that foreign country, in the buyer's place, until it is delivered, the risk is of the seller. After it is delivered, the risk is of the buyer. Unloading is the buyer's responsibility in DDP. Carriage, obviously the seller has to contract for the carriage. Seller, if he doesn't contract for carriage, how will he ship it? How will he send it? So it is the seller who has to contract for carriage. But if it is, let's say he has his own, and if it's within the city, it has an own carriage, but it is the seller's obligation. Buyer has nothing to do with carriage, because he has nothing to engage. He has no obligation. He has to wait and watch for the goods to arrive. Insurance, A5B5, insurance, there is no obligation on either party. Depending upon who wants to take the risk or who feels it is risky. If they want to insure, they insure. If they don't want to insure, fair enough, your call. Transport document, you're the seller, because the seller is the one who is delivering it. It is the seller who will provide any document, so that When the goods reach the buyer, the truck driver or the representative allows him to unload it. The buyer can take the delivery of the goods. So that's the seller who is supposed to give any transport document. If it is a truck receipt, a lorry receipt, or BL, airway bill, whatever the document is, which allows him to take the delivery of the goods, it is responsibility of the seller to provide that document. Export import clearance. In fact, this slide is exactly reverse. It is switched sides. In case, this is why this is the last and the most expensive from the seller's perspective, because now it is the seller who has to pay and do. It is the seller's obligation to pay and to carry out all formality of export clearance, transit clearance, and even import clearance. So even the import duties and taxes in the foreign country is to be paid by the seller. All export obligations, all export clearances, all security clearances, all import clearances, all import procedure, licensing, pre-inspection has to be done by the buyer. In short, it is door deliver. It is a door-to-door delivery. All right. The buyer is only going to unload the cargo because unloading is not covered. Checking, packing, marking. It's an obligation, obviously. Now, please remember, you have to make sure that the quantity, quality, checking, packing, not the quality, quantity, packing, counting is exactly until it is delivered. So it is up to the delivery which you'll have to take care of. And in this case, the delivery is in foreign country, then outside the country, the buyer's country. Allocation of cost, obviously all costs until the goods are delivered are of the seller. If you contract for the carriage, it is called for the seller. If you can't have an insurance, if you want to, it is seller. All duties and taxes of export, transit, and import is of the seller. In case if the seller requests the buyer to help him for contract of carriage, insurance, or import duty, or custom formalities, then that reimbursement of cost will also be there. So all of these is to be done by the seller, and seller only. Lastly, it can be then, obviously the notices have to be sent so that the buyer and the seller agree. You also have to understand here that the buyer also have to unload the goods. So it should not happen that you are reaching and delivering the goods on a Sunday where the buyer is not able to unload it. So you both have to agree on a date and a time when the goods will be delivered at the destination. Please remember, your critical aspect is the delivery date which you agree is not the date when your goods will leave your factory. It is the date when you will deliver, and the delivery means at a named place of destination. So if the delivery date is 10th of May, you'll have to recalculate and think, okay, on 10th of March or 10th of April, my goods have to leave my factory. That is your problem to calculate. The date of delivery is meaning the delivery as per Incoterms A2, which is name place of destination ready for unloading. All right. So this is A1 to A10 for DDP. So there we come. That's almost the end of our session. Just to give you a summarized version again, before we go on to Q&A, XWorks is one end of the story. DDP is another end. XWorks, FCA, and so on and so forth are the 11 Incoterms, out of which the 4 Incoterms can be technically used only for waterways, FAS, FOB, CFR, and CIF. Friends, again, I'm mentioning this very clearly. This is my way of putting this into a perspective, not necessary that you have to consider it in that sense. They are individual Incoterms. There is no right or wrong. It is an option. I say this is a option which you as a seller and a buyer decide. Many people ask me, so why would a seller agree on an XWorks? Well, many cases they do agree on XWorks because there are a lot of combination of cost and charges. Let's say if you are dealing with an odd dimension cargo, machine cargo, where you're not very sure of a lot of expenses. Number two, the buyer insisting from XWorks because he is consolidating the cargo. He's not doing one pickup from you. He's doing multiple pickups and he doesn't want to tell you, or he doesn't want to, so he's consolidating half container from you, half container from somebody, and then consolidating it and then shipping it off. So reasons could be anything. Hence, XWorks is why the buyer would prefer. Maybe buyer is a large company. He's got a very better rate of logistics and freight and other things. So he may want to do that. Why would you agree for a DDP? Why would somebody do DDP? A, customer service. You want to tell the buyer, listen, stay put. Don't do anything. Everything is on you. Everything is on me. I will deliver it to your doorstep. Okay, this is the price. Just pay for the price and take the goods. So one, that's there. Second, many times and most of the times DDP is used for replacement because you have shipped the goods are damaged, goods are not there. It's the warranty replacement. People have to, the buyer has already paid duties and taxes and cost on your goods already. So you want to replace it. So it is done generally under DDP. So it's depending upon choices, buyer and the seller, you can take whichever Incoterms. There is no right, no wrong. It is the term which is best suitable to you. All right. Once again, let me tell you, Incoterms, you should refer to the ICC website for exactly and the right details. ICC officially provides you a free, practical, free wall chart on Incoterms 2020. That's the link available to you. Feel free to go and register and download that wall chart. It will give you a lot of clarity and understanding. Once again, the logos and the Incoterms is a trademark of ICC, and please refer to ICC WBO website for further details. My thanks to each one of you who have been patiently hearing me for 2 hours now on YouTube, on this Zoom platform. Thank you so very much. Thank you, Drip Capital, for inviting me again. Friends, the presentation is available to you on the link, which is called speakerscore.com/230321, which is today's date. Thank you so much. You may refer it for your references, or you may wish to go onto the WBO website of ICC and refer to the official publication, which is available in print as well as in digital on payment basis. Thank you so very much. I will ask Vanita to take away further and we can do a Q&A. Thank you so very much, friends.
Thank you, Mr. Shah, for helping us understand all the Incoterms with respect to buyer and seller obligations, along with associated cost and risk. It was quite an engaging session, I would say. Let's just dive into the Q&A round without any further delay.
Yes, please.
We have a lot of questions for you here. So Mr. Raghuvir Negi is asking, under GST regime, BRC is not required. It is, however, required for meeting the FEMA RBI guidelines. How is it going to help exporters?
Mr. Negi, I'm not too sure how this is related to Incoterms, but what I understand is it's a general question on in terms of exports. Well, BRC is required to prove that your transaction is completed and the payment has been realized. Well, just to tell you, there's an amendment in the GST rules as well, where you require a proof of payment to be recorded. In case if the payment doesn't come, then you are required to return your GST refund as well. So it is an RBI guideline, it's a FEMA guideline where your payment proof of realization is important. So that takes care of your answer. I believe it is, I mean, it's not directly or indirectly related to Incoterms per se, but payment, it's in terms of payment. So please also differentiate that Incoterms and terms of payment are two different aspects. Incoterms is this what we've just done. In none of my transactions, in none of my explanation, I've told you how is buyer making the payment. Either is he making advance, whether it is doing an LC, whether he's doing anything else. We've not discussed that. So please understand that comes under terms of payments, which is slightly different than Incoterms. Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Just before we go ahead, a note to our audience, you can submit your questions in the Q&A section on Zoom, or also raise your hands and we'll allow you to speak to the speaker directly. For people who are watching us on YouTube, you can post your question in the live chat section. All the questions will be addressed one by one. We have a question, another question from Mr. Negi. He's saying the IGST is to be paid on FOB basis, no matter export contract is on CIF or CNF or any other Incoterms. Isn't it going to create confusion among the exporters while filing the IGST?
Mr. Negi, I think there was this confusion for a long time, but I think if you refer to the GST circulars, though again, it is not specifically and directly for this part of the session, but if you refer to the circular under GST, it says the GST or the IGST is to be paid on the transaction value. And in case of if you are doing a transaction on CIF or CFR terms, then that becomes a transaction value and not the FOB. So just go back and check on the transaction value thing. It is clarified under GST. So it's not the FOB value, it will be the transaction value. Again, that's completely on GST law. We are not doing GST at the moment. I think let's restrict on Incoterms and issues related to Incoterms at this point of time.
Mr. Naresh Kumar Dua wants to know, in case of X works, if buyer doesn't take delivery at agreed time and payment terms, uh, say proof of delivery is required, how and when can the seller get paid?
Okay, again, Mr. Dua, terms of payment is completely different than Incoterms. So let's say you have a transaction which is X works. Today was the delivery. Now, when you have delivered the goods and if the buyer has not taken the delivery, you have done your bit. Two things can happen. If your payments was in advance, you can keep the payment, you are good with it. If the buyer has not paid you, and if the payment terms were credit or any of those terms, or they were against the goods or whatever is the payment term, then technically the buyer has not obligated or not done what is part of the contract obligation. So again, you will have to go to the contract and see if the buyer or the seller, any of the party, do not fulfill their contractual obligation, what can you take further? Easier said than done, but yes, that's how it is. Now, the only good part will be that you still have the goods. So what happens is you will have to effectively use Incoterm, which is what best interested with your payment term. Let's take example. In Xworks, if you do a credit transaction and the goods are gone, it's a very risky business because now you don't have the goods, now you don't have the documentation, and the payment is coming on credit. It's very risky. And imagine that risk further added if that goods are very made to order. So now that goods are useless to you. So then in that case, if you're doing an Xbox, maybe the best matching in payment term is advance. So you will have to opt for one of them. Alternatively, obviously, I'm not promoting them, but I'm just giving, since I just happen to, look at Vanita and the drip capital, but there could be an option in terms of hedging your risk through some of the, drip capital or and their services. Okay, this is not their marketing. This is just pure coincidence that I'm trying to give you that answer, that you can hedge your risk across. But payment terms is going to be completely different. It is an obligation of the buyer to take the goods. If he is not done, in short, okay, let me put it like this. Incoterms does not provide you an answer if seller or the buyer doesn't do the obligation. It only says you have not done. So it's like this. If you are at the signal and you break the signal, that's the proof. You have broken the signal. Now, if I have to fine you for it, I have to go to the law, right? And check for breaking signal, what is the fine? What is the rule? Do you get jail? Do you get 200 rupees fine? So that's exactly. Incoterm only has proved that, okay, the buyer has not obligated to what he was supposed to do. Buyer has not fulfilled his promise of making the payment. Buyer has not fulfilled the promise of taking the delivery. What will happen action? Go back to the contract and see in the contract. Do you have an arbitration clause? Do you have a penalty of not taking the delivery? Do you have a court or international jurisdiction on what dispute resolution is there? That you'll have to follow. Right? Okay.
We will now let Mr. Harish B talk. He has raised his hand.
Yes, Harish ji. Mr. Harish, you can unmute, I believe.
I've unmuted him. Okay, I do.
Yeah, Harish. Yes,
Yeah.
Harish.
Yeah, good afternoon, sir.
Very good afternoon.
Sir, I need a small doubt.
Yeah.
That is, what is the difference between FCA terms and FAS terms, sir?
So FCA is first of all used for all the four modes of transport.
Okay.
FAS is only used for C. FCA, there are two places of delivery.
Yes, sir.
Either at your premises or at the carrier or at the named place where the buyer has nominated somebody.
Yeah, nomination. Yes, sir.
FAS is free alongside the ship. First of all, it can only be for the ship, and that means your delivery will be only next to the ship.
Yes, sir.
So typically FAS is, I'll tell you what, FAS is not very popular for most of the people because FAS is ideally used for brick bulk cargo. When you do a containerized cargo,
Okay.
it is not very prudent practice to do FAS.
Okay.
FAS is done when you do break bulk cargo, where you have tons and tons of material. Let's say you are exporting cement or you are exporting coal. So
Okay,
what
sir.
you want to do is the loading of coal takes a lot of time into the vessel. So you
Yes.
want that my delivery is completed when I've left it next to the vessel. Now, whether it takes 3 days, 20 days or 30 days to load it into the vessel is your problem.
Yes.
I have brought next to the vessel. My work is over.
Okay, sir. Okay, okay.
So FAS is used for that. That's the difference typically.
Okay, right. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yes. Can we have the next one?
Yes. So the next question is from Mr. Rashesh Vasoya. He's
Yeah.
asking if can we get an updated Incoterms book in English at any Chamber of Commerce, or what is the procedure for it to get a physical copy of it?
All right, Rashesh, you can log on to the ICC-WBO website. In fact, you can even search around the ICC India office. It is based in New Delhi. If possible, if you have a specific contact or if you require just message, I can share the details of the Indian office. They have a printed publication book. They have a digital copy. It's available on charges and cost basis. You can certainly use that. That's perfectly fine. Available.
Okay. He also has another question which says many times many exporter mention in performer invoice Incoterms as a payment term. For example, payment term CNF. This one is proper way, or this is a wrong way.
Obviously, it is wrong. So that's why I started with. I said, this is only when the problem happens. For last 20, 30 years, if you are exporters, I have got so many exporters who will say, sir, you have done everything, you explained everything. But sir, for last 30 years, we never had a problem. And we have been doing this for years. I said, yeah, agreed. So it's like this, having a fire extinguisher in your house doesn't mean that you have to use it. It's okay that you don't use it. So if there's a problem, only then there'll be an issue. Yes, it is incorrect. Terms of payment is different and Incoterms are different. So CNF was an old term. We used to write C and F, the ampersand. Then we changed it to CNF, but the correct terminology is CFR and terms of payment, whatever you would be doing. So there are two different things, terms of delivery and terms of payment. Both have to be separately mentioned.
Okay. Mr. Bhavish Chauhan wants to understand, in most of all the Incoterms, risk and responsibility is transferred from the seller to the buyer when the material is loaded onto the vessel, except for EXW. Is it true?
Bhaveshji, no, not necessary. In free carrier, it is not when you transfer it or load it. Neither it is in CPT or neither it is in, I would say, what CPT doesn't have it, neither in DAP. So it's not when you necessarily load. When you like in carriage pay to, it is when you hand it over to the carrier, not when you load it, not when the carrier loads it. So it's not that. Each of them have a different thing. So I think by now you should be clear. I believe this would have been a question. Yeah. So it's somewhere around 4 o'clock, 4:30. So I think by end you would have understood that it is different place, different point. That's why the word uses that the delivery time, exactly when the delivery happens, the risk gets transferred. So each of them have a different thing.
We'll take the next question from our YouTube participant.
Yes,
Mr.
please.
Sheikh Tariq Aziz is asking an FOB term in case a buyer is asking for insurance.
Yeah.
Can we charge him separately?
Yes. So this is something which happens on a regular basis, and this is what is called as you are modifying the terms. Please note, as we said, it is the contract which rules everything. Okay. Incoterms are also incorporated in the contract. So in case if you are using an FOB term, so please understand, as far as FOB term is concerned, you are not required, you're not obligatory to do an insurance. But if you go back to the same clause where the insurance, it said you will help the buyer to do anything related to insurance. In this case, you have been asked to take an insurance. So do it. Now, the only catch is it is not an FOB. It is not a CIF. All right. So it's an FOB plus insurance, which is not an Incoterm. So you use FOB as your Incoterm. Charge him separately for an insurance, which is like an out and out offer, which you're doing the back door, that you're keeping an insurance for him and the buyer is going to pay you for that. But as far as term is concerned, is FOB. But you can certainly do that. There is no restriction on doing anything additional until and unless both of you know. The seller and buyer have agreed, there's no problem.
So the next question is from Mr. Ambalavan.
Yeah.
He is asking what type of goods we can use under FAS instead of FOB. And under what circumstances, if not any product specific?
I think I've already answered that, Mr. Amlan. That is mainly FAS is typically used for break bulk cargo and goods which are typically non-containerized. Another thing is you used FAS typically, I mean, not from an Indian context, but still when the goods are, done through a smaller vessels or a baby vessels from a port which is not the major port. So, you want to just leave it at the ship alongside on the barge or anywhere. And then there would be a small baby vessel or a feeder vessel who would take it and then, load it onto the main shipping line. That's where you would use. But typically it's a break bulk cargo, which is done on FAS terms.
Okay. Mr. Shrikant wants to understand in CPT, who will take the responsibility of insurance?
Okay, carriage paid to, again, there is no obligation of any of the party because the risk is when you hand it over to the carrier. So until, let's assume if the CPT, or the example which we did was sending goods to Nepal, if you are handing it over at your doorstep to the driver of the truck, the carrier is the truck, it's the road transport. So you have completed your risk. So you don't have you have the least risk as a seller. Now buyer has the risk from the time it is picked up from your premises until it gets it, let's say, to Nepal. If he finds it riskier, he has to insure it. But let's say if it is an air transport and you are in a remote location where there is no airport and you're bringing it up to the airport, if you feel that is your risk, you insure it for that much. But there is no compulsion for insurance on either party. It is a obligation which has no compulsory obligation for insurance to either seller or the buyer. Incoterms only, there are two Incoterms, CIF and CIP, where I, which is insurance, is compulsory.
We are now going to let Mr. Ravi Chandra Pavisetti to speak to you, sir.
Yes, please.
Mr. Pavisetti, you are live.
Mr. Ravi, you can unmute, sir.
Mr.
Hi, sir.
Hi, good evening.
I think it was by mistake the hand was raised, but however, I would like to thank you for a very good interactive session that you have conducted. And at the same time, I would also like to thank Drip Capital for this very good program and
Thank
the
you,
initiative.
Appreciate.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you for your feedback. Yes.
Okay. Next question from Mr. Bhavish Chauhan again.
Yes.
If the term is FOB, then is it better to take insurance by the exporter until material loaded on the vessel, wherein insurance coverage from the exporter / warehouse to export country's port till it gets its custom cleared and loaded onto the vessel under pre-carriage coverage?
Mr. Bhavish, so again, understand from the perspective of Incoterms, all risk up to the delivery is yours. So for your risk, if you want to cover that, it is fine. It is not a part of the transaction cost. So that's up to you whether you want to cover that risk or you don't want to cover. Because please remember, as a prudent practice, you would want to cover it, but at the same time, do remember it's a cost addition. So if you feel there is a requirement, you please do it. There is no compulsion. You can certainly do it. And many of us would generally have a domestic insurance of goods anywhere to anywhere already in place. So again, don't do a double insurance for just heck of it. But it's completely otherwise. Yes. Sorry. Kaushik.
So we have Mr. Anirudh Yadav, who is asking what is FCR? Buyer wants to issue FCR at the time of counsel goods in FOB terms.
So FCR, I don't know what he is referring to FCR, but we need to check which Incoterms is he referring to. Is he referring to the current one? It should be a free carrier is there, but I'm not too sure what refer if he is giving. So
I guess Mr. Yadav can clarify a little bit more in the Q&A section, and we can address this question later.
Sure, certainly we can.
Okay. In case of FCA Mumbai, if the buyer insists that he will arrange for the transport from factory, then who will be doing the custom clearance?
Irrespective of who arranges the transport. So you have agreed. So let's again take FCA at Mumbai and you are supposed to deliver it up to Mumbai. Now you are modifying the term by buyer doing the transportation. All right. So only one of the obligation has been modified. Export clearance is an obligation for the exporter by default. You have not modified that. So that doesn't change in a free carrier also. So even if you have changed the transportation, the obligation of free carrier in obligation of export clearance remains with the seller only. So it's the seller who has to do it. All right. Yes. Vanita, you are muted.
Okay,
Yeah.
sorry. Another question from Mr. Amblavan. Which type of goods we can use under FAS instead of
Oh,
FOB?
that's
And
already done.
I think this is done. Yes, sorry. Some of the questions have been repeated. I'm so sorry. In CIF, do you include ENS charges? For example, you're delivering from Mumbai to Flexito.
So in CIF, well, first of all, you have to understand the freight which is included. So again, all costs until the goods are delivered on board, which includes your custom clearance, which includes your CHA charges, which include your shipping lines, loading charges, DL charges, anything at the loading port. Because please remember, export clearance is your baby any which ways, even in FOB. So that is already included. Now comes the question of freight. So generally the freight is port to port. The unloading at the port is already part of the freight. Further detention and damage is not. So port unloading on the port is included in the freight. So whatever is included in the freight contract, the buyer doesn't pay, but anything else he pays. Insurance, you are covering the insurance for the risk of the goods. So if you're covering for a port to port, you're covering the risk of anything going wrong in the sea. So that is what is covered in CFR. Anything additional, either you have to agree or you have to make sure that you are modifying the Incoterm.
Okay. We are now letting Mr. Sudeep Shetty talk. He has a question for you.
Yes.
Mr. Sudeep Shetty, you are live.
Mr. Shetty, good evening. You can unmute, sir.
Mr. Shetty?
Yeah. Good evening, sir. Can you hear me?
Very good. Yes, we can. Loud and clear.
Yeah. Sir, I need one small question. If terms of shipment is FOB.
Yes,
okay,
sir.
In such case, sometimes we are asking for shipping line to issue the RFSBL, receipt RFSBL.
Yes.
Is it
ready for shipment?
Yes, receipt for shipment. Is it that risk is covered for the seller or it's risk transferred to the buyer?
Sir, now you know FOB and you know that the delivery is completed when it is on board.
Exactly.
So unless and until you have a shipped on board BL, so let's assume you have got a ready for shipment or a RFS BL dated today, 23rd of March.
Correct.
Okay. Whereas the shipped on board was on 24th of March. The risk until 24th of March remains with the seller because it is not on board. Ready for shipment or RFSBL is only for you to convince the buyer that, listen, I'm telling honestly that the goods have gone. It's not with me. Because generally what happens, we tell the buyer that the goods have gone, but they're still at the port or still at the warehouse. So it is purely...
It's a custodian, it's already transferred to shipping line, right?
That's okay. That doesn't matter. Sir, in case, let me put it like this. In case you miss the vessel,
okay.
In case it is
if
not...
the vessel or something happened in the port, then the responsibility is the seller.
Till it is on board, the risk is yours. So let's say if you get a shipped on board BL dated 1st of April, from 23rd of March till 1st of April, till it is on board, risk is yours.
Okay, sir. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
We have another question from Mr. Bhavish Chauhan. He's asking, sir, can you kindly give an example of inland waterways with Incoterms?
Inland waterways with Incoterms, you can do FOB. So if let's say you are doing, I mean, in India, we are not very used to using an inland term, inland mode, because somehow the inland water transport is not that great within India. But let's say if you're shipping a cargo from say Bombay to Calcutta, and instead of doing by road, you're doing it by sea, you can do an FOB. So the difference is typically a voyage. The voyage is a domestic voyage. So it remains the same Incoterm. There's no other issue.
The next question is from Mr. Ketan from YouTube. He's asking if the damage is due to accident before the loading to the vessel, then whose responsibility it is?
I believe you're referring to an FOB Incoterm. It is yours. If it's an FOB, it is a seller.
There is another, let's just address Zoom questions now. If in CIF sales, the exporter in our case obtains his full payment terms after the receipt of the goods at the destination port after joint survey by an I don't think this is this a question? Can you, sir, Mr. Shah, if you can refer to this?
I am not too sure which one are you referring to, because
the second last question that we see.
Okay, yeah. So an anonymous attendee is saying CIF sales, the exporter in our case obtains full payment after receipt of the goods at the destination port. Yeah, but what is the question? I mean, I'm not too sure. And
Yeah.
so Mr. I think it has to be there's no question here. We'll have to get an answer, question clarity. Yeah.
Okay. Mr. Anil Kumar, under DAP, who pays for the who pays for the custom handling process at the destination port, not the duty and the taxes?
All right. So when we talk about, so let me go back to that. If you go back to that slide, which talks about export-import clearances, it is very clear. So they have given a 4 broader aspect. The security clearances, which meaning custom clearances or any of those sort. Pre-shipment inspection related or post-ship import related. Duties and taxes, all the procedures. So everything related to customs and the procedure will be done by, even in DAP, even in delivered at port, delivered at place, it will be done by the buyer. So typically what happens is, let me put it like this. If you're doing a DAP, you clear the cargo, the goods have been loaded onto the ship takes the cargo to New York. At New York, when the goods are offloaded by the shipping company, now the buyer's representative comes, he does the custom formalities, he does the paperwork, he does the licensing, he pays the duties, and then hands it over to your representative, who will then lift the cargo, put it into a trailer, and the trailer will go to the buyer's warehouse. So the process which is done completely under customs clearance. Now, if that takes a couple of days and there's a damage or detention, that is all to be done by the buyer, because the entire process of custom clearance processing is to be done by the buyer.
We'll take the next question from Mr. Harish B. He wants to understand the difference between FCA and FOB.
So Mr. Harish, so first and foremost, FOB is only for sea or waterways, whereas FCA is for all modes of transport. FOB, the delivery is on board the vessel, whereas in FCA, there are 2 options. Either it can be at the seller's premises loaded on the vehicle which the buyer sends, or it can be at any other place, any other authorized nominated person by the buyer. So both of these are the main differences between FOB and FCA.
Next question is by Mr. Tausif Ahmed. He wants to know what are the expenses should we include to quote prices for FOB?
All expenses until the goods are loaded on the vessel. So cost of the goods, transportation to the port clearance, port custom charges, shipping line charges for you to load any of the detention damages you are expecting that it may incur. If you want to insure your cargo for your own safety, premium on that, all costs until the goods are delivered, documentation, bank charges, if you are getting or availing some facility from certain banks or certain institutions, interest on that, all of those plus your profit. So FOB will include all costs until that point.
Next question is from Mr. Naresh Kumar Dua. Does high sea sales cover? Is high sea sales covered under Incoterms? If yes, how?
Well, high sea sale has nothing to do with Incoterm. So high sea sale is typically when the sale is in transit, that goods have been, I mean, the sale has happened or transfer of sale has happened. Typically, the transaction will still remain with the same Incoterm. So high sea sale typically will have no impact with the Incoterm, or Incoterm will have no impact on high CCL. It's only that as a high CCL buyer, whatever is the risk which is there attached to the Incoterm, that you are also taking it over. So let's say if it was the original transaction was an FOB and you have taken the high CCL, then that transaction is now yours. So that risk is FOB. So you get the risk. So that's how it will work on.
We will now allow Mr. Rakesh Anand to ask you a question directly. Mr. Anand, you are live. We've unmuted you.
Yeah. This is regarding, actually, I put in earlier the request, it didn't go through correctly.
Yeah.
My terms are that I am shipping to my destination CIF.
Okay.
Sorry?
Yeah, go ahead. Okay.
By sea. And my insurer here in India says that he cannot insure me for payments of the claim that might happen due to shortage, due to carriage. He says it only can go to the importer.
Correct. He's right.
So what terms should I have? Because my buyer doesn't pay me till he takes the sound goods. It's a joint survey done at destination. What should be the terms?
Rakeshji, first of all, whenever you do a CIF,
Yes.
you are paying insurance premium for the buyer because the risk of any loss or damage is already transferred from you to the buyer when the goods are on board. So hence insurance is in the insurance. In fact, why your insurance agent is saying so, just go and check your insurance certificate. The insurance certificate will say beneficiary buyer. So in that case, if this is what it is. Now, if you want to be the person to be the beneficiary, you will have to take the risk. So in that case, probably you will have to switch from CIF to a DAP term.
Yes.
And DAP, the buyer's place or port or a buyer's destination. So until the goods are delivered, it is your risk. Okay. And if anything goes wrong in that transit, now please, it will be to your account. Now, please understand, when you mentioned to me about risk, there are two kinds of risk. One is risk in terms of marine risk, damage, seepage of water, collision, loss, misplaced. And one is wrong goods. That is a quality dispute. None of the marine insurance will cover quality dispute. Please understand that. If you have sent the wrong size, wrong goods, wrong product, no insurance will cover that.
Sir, my shipments are all by refrigerator container. And the temperature variation is stated in the marine policy as well as in the terms. What my difficulty is that when my cargo arrives at destination port,
yes,
the joint survey done.
Okay.
The goods are handed over to the party only after it is of sound quality. That's fine.
So the problem is, so I understand this, then none of the insurance will agree to that. If your insurance is accepting that for the quality, let's assume that by whatever be the container, if your goods are not of sound quality, your buyer will not pay, correct?
Correct.
And you want to go to the insurance. Does your insurance cover that? Because quality deterioration will not be covered by any marine insurance. If your insurance is covering it, then you'll have to go to a DAP term. Then you will get it.
Okay. But the problem for me is that I am covered for marine variation in temperature. During when I hand over the container to the steamer company, there is variation possibility which damage the cargo, which is covered under my marine policy.
So then you'll have to go for DAP and you'll have to have a logger along with the container, which will prove that the temperature was changed. Or there was a difference in the temperature minus the variation allowed by you.
I'm trying to understand what is the difference between CIF and DAP.
The risk is terminated when the risk is terminated in CIF when the goods are on board. Whereas in DAP, the risk is transferred when the goods are at the named place of destination. So in DAP, it is your risk until the goods are transferred. I mean, until they are on the destination. Whereas in CIF, it becomes buyer's risk.
So the difference is CIF, the destination port, and DAP, the destination port. Is that the same?
Place is same. The risk is getting differently transferred, sir.
All
Sir,
right.
in CIF, the risk is transferred when you load it at a port in India.
Okay.
But in DAP, the risk is transferred when you deliver it at the buyer's premises or at the port where after your inspection is happened.
I understand. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Anand. We'll take the next question from an anonymous attendee. In FOB, who should pay the BL charges? Or it can be decided within the buyer or the seller?
So typically, let us be very clear. Of course, in practice, it is the seller who pays it, but let's be understanding that the contract of carriage is being done by the buyer and the BL charges should be paid by the buyer. That's what is the preference of the law. But obviously, because we deal in a business where, it's mutual, business aggregate that we say, okay, we will bear the cost. And you want the BL also because it is the title of the goods which you want to keep it with you, unless, so that the payment terms and the can be put forward. So you are also okay to pay that. But typically, if you see, is the contract of carriage done by the buyer and the BL is issued on his behalf. So it is the buyer who has to pay the charges of the BL.
The next question is from Mr. Umesh Gupta. He's asking when delivery will happen in EXW, when the seller sends. So when does the delivery happen in XWorks? When the seller sends notice for material pickup, or and what happens if the buyer does not send a vehicle for pickup?
So the delivery happens when you keep the goods ready at the name place of delivery, ready for the buyer to pick up the goods on the agreed date. If the buyer doesn't pick up, answer is the same what we've done earlier. It is the default on the part of the buyer. As per Incoterms, any costs incurred because of the buyer not picking up the goods is to be paid by the buyer. But how do you recover that and how will you enforce that has to be looked in the contract about how you will enforce any dispute arising if any of the obligations is not met, either by the seller or the buyer.
Mr. Madan Lal wants to understand, he's asking you to elaborate on security aspects in Incoterm.
Mr. Lal, I believe when you say security aspects, do you believe in terms of the custom clearance and the other aspects? So we refer to any of the custom clearance. So I'm not too sure what, if you refer to the term which was part of the export-import clearance definition, security clearance, we are referring to any form of security clearance at the port of the custom. So it could be related to custom procedure. It could be related to certain ancillary laws, like if you are dealing with medical or pharma product, there is a drug control requirement. There is a plant quarantine requirement. So all of those part of security clearance comes part of that regulations. So all of that has to be taken care. And depending upon what Incoterm you're doing, either the exporter or the importer will take care of it.
Mr. Kiran Shinde wants to understand, in India for DAP term, import SIMS registration, responsibility lies with the seller or the buyer?
Yeah. Now, so I think I think in XWorks also somebody was mentioning about it in a different way. They said shipping bill, who will prepare? So Vinayak, yes. So please understand the DAP term, the risk of import clearance is of the process of import clearance and the procedure of import clearance in DAP is of the buyer. So SIM, which is part of the requirement of the custom clearance, will be done by the buyer itself. So you in India will do the needful. Now the question makes little change. Let's say if it's a DAP, where the seller is supposed to do the import clearance. Now he has to apply SIM, which is not practically possible. So that's exactly where the terminology which we've been discussing in the entire Incoterm, wherever required, the buyer will help the seller to do the import, export clearance and pay for the cost and everything. So it's sometimes not practically possible, but understand the underlying principle that the job is of the seller or the buyer, depending upon which Incoterm you're doing. But if it is not practically possible, like in India, you have to file the bill of entry. you have to file shipping bill. It has to be either it's in your name. You should have your IC. So it is important. So you might be required to assist the buyer and the seller. The cost and the obligation is borne by the buyer any which ways. So answer to your question is you will have to do SIMS as a buyer in DAP.
We'll take the last questions. We are running short of time right now. Mr. Vinayak Devar Gudi wants to know, is there any such term as FOR? If yes, where it can be used?
FOR is free on road. I believe this was very, very old Incoterm, maybe much earlier than 2000 as well. I have not seen a FOR term right from 2000. So not at least for last 20 years. So ideally you can't use it technically on Incoterms. People have, modified. It's like how we all use, there is no delicacy called Chinese bale, but India ne bana liya hai, So that's how exactly it is. So people have created from FOB, कि अगर road पे जा रहा है तो FOR कर दो. Ideally, there's no Incoterm technically in 2020 or in 2010 or anybody where it is FOR. You will have to use FCA. You can use CPT if you're doing carriage pay too. So there is no FOR term technically available. You will have to use the 11 Incoterms which are available suited to your transaction.
So Mr. Shah, we are running short of time. However,
Yes.
we suggest that maybe you can look at the Q&A section, and if there is any question which is interesting or which we can take up right now, probably one or two more questions.
Okay. Otherwise, that would ideally be unfair for people who have asked. I think let's do one thing. Maybe if you can take those questions and save it somewhere and then share it with me, I'll answer all of them on your YouTube channel or anywhere else and leave them the answers. But so I think
we can share your email ID and people can write to you directly.
Would
that be okay?
Yeah, that should be okay, because I think most of the answers we have answered now. This is more specific to specific cases individually. Akash, just a quick point which you have asked, again not directly related to Incoterms. GST on freight, by the way, export ke upar freight, export freight, there is no GST, there's an exemption. So you can check on that. Sumendro, I have again said there's nothing called as FOR. I think more or less it's a specific queries on individual aspects. All right, I think we are good, Vinita.
Okay. Sorry, guys, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you once again, Mr. Shah, for sharing your knowledge with our fellow exporters. Thank you to all our viewers for joining us today. You will soon receive a short survey form on Zoom or on your email IDs. Request you all to share your valuable feedback and topics that you want to hear from us about. We'll soon come back to you with more interesting topics and insightful speakers. Follow us on social media to stay in touch with Drip Capital. You can also follow our blogs and newsletter for recent updates and insights on foreign trade related matters. Have a good evening. Goodbye.
Good night. Thank you.